There is something underneath Sydney that the city has never officially acknowledged. Not a sewer, not a drainage tunnel, not a maintenance shaft. Something older. Something that was already there when the first colonial boots pressed into this continent's red earth, and something that has been quietly, methodically, and deliberately kept out of every formal record since. Tonight we are going to follow that silence. We are going to trace the shape of what is missing, measure the gaps in the archive, and sit with what the sandstone has been holding for longer than anyone in an official position is comfortable admitting. If you're watching this to fall asleep, that's exactly why I make these videos. Maybe subscribe and let me know, where are you right now and what time is it? Sydney is a city built on a lie of simplicity. From the harbour, on a clear morning, it looks self-explanatory. The bridge, the opera house, the ferry wakes, cutting white lines across blue water, the sandstone cliffs framing the coves to the north and south, pale gold in early light. It looks like a place that has always been exactly what it is, a modern port city, confident and open, without the kind of layered geological and historical secrets that belong to older civilizations. Rome has its catacombs, Paris has its ossuary. Istanbul has 17 layers of city beneath its streets. Sydney, in the official imagination, has sandstone and sunshine. But official imaginations are built to be comfortable, not accurate. Beneath Sydney, beneath the railways, and the utilities, and the car parks, and the basements of buildings that were raised over older buildings, that were raised over even older ones, there are passages, there are chambers, there are spaces that do not appear on any engineering schematic, that do not feature in any public heritage register, that geotechnical reports have noted and then declined to investigate, that construction crews have broken through and then sealed again within days, that oral accounts from multiple independent sources over more than a century and a half describe in nearly identical language, and that the city has never once officially tried to explain. Tonight we are going to sit with that. We are not going to rush it. We are not going to arrive at a dramatic conclusion in the first 20 minutes and then spend the rest of the time defending it. We are going to take the long road, the slow road, the road that the evidence itself insists on, because when you are dealing with something that has been buried physically and institutionally for this long, the only honest approach is patience. So settle in, let the city noise fall away, and let's begin with the stone. Hawkesbury sandstone is not an ordinary building material. It is not quarried in the way that most stone is quarried, extracted from a seam, shaped by human hands, transported to a site. In Sydney, the sandstone is the site. It is the substrate on which everything else sits. The city was not placed beside the stone or on top of the stone. The city was cut into it, built from it, and in many cases simply left to rest inside cavities that already existed within it. The formation is Triassic. That means it was laid down roughly 240 million years ago, when the landmass that would eventually become Australia was still part of the supercontinent Gondwana, still connected to what is now Antarctica, still inhabited by creatures so remote from modern experience that the gap feels almost metaphysical. It was deposited in a broad river system, sand and silt accumulating in layers over millions of years, compressing under its own weight, and eventually lithifying into the fine-grained, cross-bedded sandstone that underlies virtually the entire Sydney Basin. What this means structurally is that the Hawkesbury sandstone is a layered material. It has horizontal bedding planes surfaces along which the original sedimentary layers compress together, and it has vertical joint systems running through it, lines of weakness where the stone has fractured over geological time in response to the pressures of continental drift, erosion, and the slow unloading of material from above. These joint systems are not random. They run in consistent orientations across the formation. They are, in geological language, systematic, and they create, naturally, a network of linear voids within the stone. Those natural voids are real. They are documented. Cavers explore them. Geologists study them. Heritage registers include some of them. The natural void system within the Hawkesbury sandstone is not in dispute. What is in dispute quietly, carefully, institutionally, is whether all of the void spaces beneath Sydney are natural. Because here is what the geologists who have actually worked in the stone, the ones who have spent careers studying it rather than simply citing it in reports, will tell you when you ask them directly. Natural joint-controlled voids have a particular morphology. They are irregular. They follow the joint planes, but they widen and narrow unpredictably. They have rough ceilings and floors. They accumulate debris, spalled stone, mineral deposits, organic material carried in by water. They do not have level floors. They do not have consistent height. They do not have smooth walls, where the stone appears to have been systematically removed. And they do not have openings that are oriented towards specific compass bearings in a way that suggests intentional alignment. Some of the voids beneath Sydney have all of those things that natural voids should not have. That is the problem. That has always been the problem. And it is a problem that nobody with institutional authority has ever formally agreed to examine. Before there was a Sydney, there was country. The Gadigal people, one of the language groups of the Eora Nation, had been living on the land surrounding the harbour for at minimum 65,000 years. That number is worth sitting with. 65,000 years is more than 3 times longer than the entire span of recorded human history in Europe. It is longer than the existence of the wheel, longer than the first agricultural settlements, longer than every civilization that Western history considers foundational. The Gadigal were here longer than any of that. And they were not simply here in the sense of being present. They were here in the sense of knowing the land with a depth and precision that comes from 65,000 years of continuous relationship. They knew the harbour tides. They knew the fish runs. They knew the fire patterns of the bush. They knew the water table, the seasonal springs, the caves above the waterline, and the passages below it. They knew the sandstone in a way that is genuinely difficult for people raised in a tradition that treats knowledge as text to fully understand, not as geological classification, but as living relationship, encoded in ceremony, embedded in story, transmitted through a knowledge system that maintained accuracy over spans of time that dwarf the entire Western scholarly tradition. The colonial record, because it was produced by people who did not have the conceptual tools to recognize what they were seeing, tends to describe the Gadigal relationship to the land in passive terms. Hunting and gathering, seasonal movement, shelter in caves and rock overhangs. This description is not exactly wrong, but it is catastrophically incomplete. In the same way that describing a surgeon as someone who carries knives is not exactly wrong, but catastrophically incomplete. What the colonial record misses, and what subsequent research has only slowly begun to recover, is the extent to which Aboriginal Australians across the continent engaged in deliberate landscape modification. The Brewarina fish traps on the Darling River are the most famous example stone structures of extraordinary engineering sophistication that directed, captured, and managed fish stocks over tens of thousands of years, representing one of the oldest human constructions on Earth. But the fish traps are only famous because they survived above the waterline, visible, undeniable. The modifications that occurred below ground have no such advantage. They are invisible by definition. And in Sydney, where the colonial project systematically dismantled, buried, and built over almost every surface trace of Gadigal presence within the first 2 decades of settlement, the underground record is the only record that might still be intact. There is an oral tradition, recorded patchily by ethnographers, maintained more completely within community, that the sandstone beneath the harbour country contained spaces of significance. Not simply natural caves used for shelter, but shaped spaces. Spaces that had been worked. Spaces that served specific purposes within the ceremonial and knowledge systems of the Gadigal and neighbouring groups. The specifics of what those purposes were are not mine to relay in full, and are in any case not fully accessible through the written record. But the existence of the tradition itself, the fact that multiple independent accounts, collected by different researchers in different periods, converge on the same basic claim that the underground was intentionally shaped and intentionally significant, is itself a form of evidence that the formal archive has never properly grappled with. The first fleet arrived in January 1788. Within weeks, the process of covering over had already begun. This is not a metaphor. It is a literal description of what the first colonial construction crews did when they encountered the sandstone terrain of Port Jackson. They covered it. They filled in natural depressions. They bridged rock overhangs. They diverted surface water into channels that ran over existing low points in the topography. The first convict labor details were organized not to build structures on the land, but to modify the land itself, to make it legible, flat, manageable, European. What this means in practical terms is that the earliest colonial construction activity in Sydney involved substantial earth-moving and stone-cutting in areas that already had existing subsurface features. The first drains were not dug from scratch. They were extended from depressions that already existed, channels that already drained downhill, low points in the bedrock that already directed water toward the harbour. The colonial drainage system, in its earliest form, was laid on top of a landscape that had its own drainage logic, a logic that, in sandstone country, often follows the joint systems and includes subsurface voids. The engineers who did this work were not geologists. They were military men and convict overseers with practical construction experience and an urgent mandate to make the settlement functional. They did not, in most cases, record what they found beneath the surface with any scientific care. What they recorded was whether a given section of drain was completed, whether a given area of ground had been leveled, whether a given building could be sited without the foundation failing. The nature of what was already in the ground was relevant only insofar as it affected those practical outcomes. But occasionally, very occasionally, the nature of what was already in the ground was sufficiently unusual that it made it into the record anyway. The earliest of these records dates to 1793, 5 years into the colonial settlement. A work crew extending a covered drain in the area that would later become the Rocks District on the western shore of Sydney Cove broke into what the foreman's log describes as a pre-existing formation of considerable extent. The entry is 4 lines long. It notes that the formation appeared to extend beyond the visible section. It notes that the crew was redirected to work around it rather than through it. It notes that the section was sealed, and then it moves on to the next item of business, as though what had just been described was a minor administrative inconvenience rather than an extraordinary discovery. A pre-existing formation of considerable extent. In 1793, in sandstone country, 5 years after European arrival, in an area that had been Gadigal territory for 65,000 years, the formation was sealed. The record moved on, and that pattern discovery, brief notation, seal, move on, is the pattern that defines the entire subsequent archive. The 1830s were the decade in which Sydney's colonial administration began to take its infrastructure seriously. The population had grown beyond the improvised arrangements of the first settlement. There were proper streets now, proper wharves, the beginnings of permanent public buildings. There was civic ambition, and civic ambition requires civic infrastructure, and civic infrastructure requires surveying. You cannot build a city if you do not know what is in the ground. The Survey Corps began systematic subsurface investigation in the late 1820s and continued through the 1830s and into the 1840s. Their mandate was practical: locate water, understand drainage, assess ground stability for proposed buildings. Their methods were limited by the technology of the period: hand-augering, exploratory shafts, and the systematic questioning of anyone who had been involved in the earliest construction activity. What they found was, by any measure, unexpected. The survey reports from this period, several of which survive in the State Archives of New South Wales, though not all have been catalogued in a way that makes them easy to locate, describe, with some regularity, The encountering of subsurface voids in the Sydney CBD and inner eastern suburbs that exceed in size and regularity what the surveyors were prepared to attribute to natural causes. The language is careful. These were professional men operating within a professional culture that prized understatement and practical utility. They did not write dramatically. But when a surveyor who has spent 30 years working in stone writes that a particular void displays characteristics inconsistent with natural joint-controlled formation and then recommends further investigation before overlying construction is authorized, the understatement does not hide the substance of what is being said. Further investigation was not authorized. Construction proceeded above several of these noted anomalies throughout the 1840s and 1850s. In some cases, the anomalies were filled sand and rubble packed into the upper portions of whatever void had been found, enough to provide a stable surface for the foundations above. In other cases, the foundations were simply designed to span the void rather than rest within it. In either case, the anomaly was incorporated into the built environment and the record was closed. One specific survey note from 1841 in the area of what is now Macquarie Street describes a passage running at a depth of approximately 40 feet below the surface, oriented in a north-northwest direction, with a floor described as level and smooth, as though by long use or deliberate working, and walls, without the rough character typical of natural joint erosion. The surveyor estimated the passage was at least 60 feet long in the direction explored, with no termination visible in the light available. The recommendation at the end of the entry: note for drainage records, no action required. Level and smooth, as though by long use or deliberate working, no action required. In 1862, a crew working on an extension of the colonial water supply infrastructure in the inner city area encountered a passage. This is the record that most researchers who have worked on this question end up returning to, because it is the most specific, the most technically detailed, and the most difficult to explain away. The passage was encountered at a depth of approximately 32 feet below street level. It was oriented north-northeast. Its floor was level, not approximately level, not roughly horizontal, but level in the way that a floor is level when someone has made it level. Its walls were smooth. Its ceiling height was measured at 9 feet in the section explored. 9 feet. That is not a natural joint void. Natural joint voids in Hawkesbury sandstone do not maintain a consistent 9-foot ceiling height over a distance of any significance. They are irregular. They collapse at irregular intervals. They narrow and widen unpredictably. This passage did not do those things. The crew explored it for what the record describes as a distance of approximately 50 feet in the north-northeast direction before the section supervisor directed them to stop and return to surface. The reason given in the record for stopping was not that the passage ended. It was not that the passage became impassable. It was that continuing would have required the crew to move beyond the area of their assigned work. Beyond the 50 feet they explored, the passage continued. The record describes the passage floor as carrying no debris, no accumulated sediment, no biological material, no mineral deposits that would be expected in a natural void that had been subject to groundwater infiltration over geological time. The floor was bare sandstone, level, with what the surveyor's note describes as the character of a floor that has been kept clear. The character of a floor that has been kept clear. There is a discipline required, when you are reading records like this, to stay with what is actually being said, rather than rushing ahead to conclusions. What is actually being said in that phrase, in the careful, professional language of a 19th century colonial surveyor who had no interest in drama and every interest in technical accuracy, is that the floor of this passage, encountered 32 feet beneath Sydney in 1862, looked like it had been used. Not recently, not necessarily within living memory, but used, maintained, kept. The record then notes that the passage was sealed, a notation was added to the drainage file, the crew returned to their scheduled work. 54 years later, in 1916, a crew working on early infrastructure for the City Circle Railway encountered, in roughly the same area, a void at roughly the same depth. The void was noted, measured, sealed, and its entry filed under geological anomaly. The 1,862 record was not cross-referenced. Either nobody looked, or someone looked and chose not to note the connection. 9 years after the 1862 passage, in 1871, a construction crew excavating for the Paddington Reservoir encountered something that the project engineer apparently found sufficiently unusual to describe in considerable technical detail. What they found was a chamber, not a passage, not a narrow corridor, a chamber. The engineer's report, which survives, though it was not catalogued under a heading that would make it easy to find without knowing what you were looking for, describes a roughly square space, approximately 30 feet on each side, at a depth of 40 feet below the original ground surface. The ceiling was roughly 9 feet above the floor. The walls were sandstone, but not natural sandstone. The surfaces had been worked, smoothed, and in some sections what the engineer describes as dressed, that is, systematically finished, in a way consistent with deliberate construction rather than natural formation or casual tool use. In 2 of the walls there were openings, passages leading out from the chamber into the surrounding stone. The engineer records that he and one of his crew entered one of these passages for a distance of what he estimated as 20 yards before returning. The passage continued beyond that point. He does not record entering the second passage. His report recommends that the chamber be incorporated into the reservoir design rather than destroyed. He notes that its structural integrity appears sound, that the stonework suggests great age, and that the incorporation would save excavation cost. The recommendation was overruled. The chamber was filled to provide a stable base for the reservoir construction above. The filled chamber is still there, below the Paddington Reservoir complex, 40 feet down, sealed in the 1870s. The passages that led out from it, they are still there too, in the sense that fill material does not flow into a passage that continues into solid stone. Whatever is beyond the point that the engineer reached in 1871, it has been undisturbed since 1871. That is 155 years. The sandstone preserves almost perfectly in dry conditions. Aerated zones within the Hawkesbury Formation, zones above the permanent water table where air circulates through the joint system, maintain remarkably stable temperature and humidity. Organic material introduced into such zones can survive for extraordinary lengths of time. Inscriptions in the stone do not erode. Pigment does not fade. Structural modifications do not collapse unless they were poorly executed. And the passages described in the 1862 and 1,871 records level floors, consistent height, dressed walls suggest anything but poor execution. What is down there, beneath the Paddington Reservoir, has been sitting quietly in the dark for 155 years. Nobody has looked. The City Circle Railway is Sydney's underground loop, the arc of tunnels and stations that runs beneath the CBD, connecting Central to Town Hall to Wynyard to Circular Quay and back around. It was planned from the late 19th century, begun seriously in the 1910s, and progressively opened through the 1920s and 1930s. It is, in the language of infrastructure history, a significant engineering achievement, deep tunneling through sandstone in a dense urban environment with all of the technical complexity that implies. It is also, for the purposes of this conversation, a remarkable source of evidence. Because when you build a railway tunnel through sandstone, you generate records, engineering records, geological records, survey records, contractor records. You generate daily logs from the tunneling crews. You generate reports from the supervising engineers. You generate correspondence between the project management and the Department of Public Works. You generate an enormous quantity of paper, And much of that paper survives in the State Archives and the Mitchell Library and the various institutional collections that absorb the records of the early 20th century New South Wales public works apparatus. And within that enormous quantity of paper, there are anomalies. Not dramatic anomalies, not pages torn out, not suspicious gaps in the date sequence, not the sudden cessation of a record that had been proceeding normally. The anomalies are subtler than that, which in some ways makes them more unsettling. What you find when you read the City Circle construction records carefully is a pattern of deviations, small, unexplained alterations to the planned alignment of the tunnels, departures from the original route that were not explained in the project documentation, and that, when you map them against the known geology, do not appear to have been driven by the geological factors that tunnel alignments are normally adjusted to accommodate. The original planned route of the City Circle took it through several sections of the inner city at depths that would have intersected with the geological zones where the pre-existing voids had been noted in the circle. 19th century surveys. The as-built route, the route of the actual tunnels, deviates from the plan in those sections. The tunnels run deeper than planned in 2 segments and shallower than planned in 1 segment. The deviations are documented in the engineer's reports as having been made in response to site conditions, which is standard language. And language that is not necessarily misleading. Site conditions do cause alignment adjustments in tunnel construction. But the specific site conditions that prompted these specific adjustments are not identified. The reports note the deviation and the general rationale without specifying what was encountered. In 1921, a Department of Public Works internal report on the City Circle construction, not a public report, an internal administrative document noted that in 2 zones of the tunnel alignment, construction crews had encountered pre-existing voids in the sandstone that exceeded the size and character of natural joint-controlled cavities. The report identified these zones as Town Hall and the southeastern section approaching Circular Quay. It noted that in both zones, the project engineers had elected to route the tunnels to avoid the pre-existing features, rather than to investigate or incorporate them. It noted that the pre-existing features had been sealed where the construction disturbed them, and it recommended that the nature and extent of the features be noted in the geological record but not made the subject of further investigation as part of the current project. The recommendation was followed, the notation was made, and the internal report was filed in a location within the Public Works Archive that is not easily accessible, not classified, not restricted, simply filed in a way that requires knowing it exists to find it. That 1921 report represents the most formally authoritative acknowledgement, prior to the metro construction era, that something pre-existing and structurally significant exists beneath Sydney's CBD. It was produced by the Government Engineering Department. It used sober, technical language. It reached a clear finding. The voids are there, they are not natural, and they are not going to be investigated. The Eastern Suburbs Railway was Sydney's last major underground rail construction project of the 20th century. Planning began in the 1960s. Construction ran from 1974 to 1979, with the line opening in stages between 1979 and 1980. It runs from Central Station east and south through a series of deep-cut tunnels and stations, Museum, St. James, and then east through King's Cross, Edgecliff, and Bond Junction to Bondi Junction. The Museum and St. James stations, at the northern end of the line closest to the CBD, were cut through sandstone at significant depth. Museum Station sits approximately 35 feet below street level at its deepest. St. James is deeper. The tunnelling in this section passed through exactly the geological zones that the 1921 Public Works report had identified as containing pre-existing anomalies. The construction diaries from the Eastern Suburbs Railway tunnelling, kept by site engineers and shift supervisors as a routine project record, are held in the State Records of New South Wales. They are not restricted. Anyone can request them. But like the 1921 report, they are not catalogued in a way that makes their relevance to this question immediately apparent. You find them when you know what to look for, or when you spend enough time in the archive that you start reading everything. 3 entries from those diaries are worth noting specifically. The first is from November 1979. A shift supervisor at the museum station excavation noted that the tunneling crew had broken through into a void on the eastern wall of the station cavity. The void was described as extending beyond the visible section in the direction of what would be the CBD to the north. The void was measured at its opening as approximately 12 feet high and 8 feet wide. The entry notes that the crew was halted, the shift supervisor contacted the project engineer, and the void was sealed within the shift. The project engineer's log for that date contains a single-line notation. Void encountered, eastern wall, museum. Sealed. No further action. No further action. A dozen tunnelers just broke through a wall into an 8-foot wide, 12-foot high void extending northward beneath the CBD, and the response was to seal it and note no further action. The second entry is from March 1980, during tunneling for the St. James extension. A crew working at a depth of approximately 60 feet encountered what the diary describes as stonework, not natural stone, but fitted stonework, stone that had been cut and placed rather than simply formed by geological process. The entry is brief and deliberately matter-of-fact in tone, in the way that entries are sometimes written by people who are not sure how to describe what they are looking at. It notes the stonework, notes that it was at 60 feet depth, notes that the crew was redirected to a different section of the excavation, and notes that the section was backfilled by the end of the shift. Fitted stonework at 60 feet. Beneath St. James. In 1980, the third entry is from September 1980. This is the one that researchers who have worked on this question return to most often, because it is the longest and the most specific. A night shift supervisor, his name appears in the diary, but I am not going to reproduce it here, wrote an extended entry describing the crew's encounter with a passage running perpendicular to the tunnel axis at St. James Station workface. The passage, he writes, was between 8 and 12 feet high, with a consistent width of approximately 7 feet. The floor was level. The air inside the passage was dry and still. He specifically notes the absence of the humidity and air movement typical of natural void systems connected to the surface. The crew explored the passage for a distance of 40 feet in one direction before receiving direction from the project engineer to return to surface. The night shift supervisor's word for what the crew found in those 40 feet was outstanding. Not unusual, not anomalous, outstanding. The diary then has an 11-day gap before the next entry. 11 days in which, presumably, the standard project record-keeping continued in other forms, but in which the specific diary maintained by this shift supervisor contains nothing. When the diary resumes, it does so with routine tunneling notes. The passage is not mentioned again. Archives do not simply contain records. They also contain the shapes of what is missing. When researchers study historical archives, they learn to read absence as well as presence. A letter that has been sent but not received. A page removed from a bound volume. A date range in which a particular record-keeping practice, normally followed with great regularity, suddenly and without explanation ceases. These absences are not always significant. Papers get lost, damaged, misfiled, eaten by silverfish, left behind when officers move. But when the absences cluster, when the gaps concentrate in specific date ranges, in specific subject areas, in specific locations, the clustering itself becomes evidence. The archival record for Sydney's underground infrastructure between 1930 and 1960 has gaps that cluster. They do not cluster randomly. They cluster against the locations and date ranges in which underground construction activity was most likely to have intersected with the anomalous zones identified in the pre-1930 record. The relevant sections of the Public Works Department records for the 1930s, the period in which Sydney's water and sewer infrastructure was being substantially expanded, are thinner than they should be. Given what we know about the scale of the construction activity and the normal record-keeping practices of the department, specific project files contain summary documents, but not the underlying survey notes that summary documents are normally drawn from. Specific date ranges in specific locations have diary entries that are consecutive but omit what would normally be included, the geological observations that tunneling supervisors were required to record. This is not a dramatic grand conspiracy. Conspiracies of the kind that popular imagination favors organized, centrally directed, maintained in secrecy across generations almost never survive in the real world, because real organizations are too complex, too prone to internal disagreement and accidental disclosure to maintain that kind of coordinated silence. What survives, and what leaves exactly the archival pattern we are looking at, is something much more mundane: institutional habit. A culture in which, at some point early in the process, the implicit understanding formed that certain things are not to be made the subject of formal investigation, and in which that understanding was maintained not through explicit instruction, but through the accumulated weight of precedent. Nobody told the 1960s public works clerk to misfile the survey notes. Nobody needed to. The misfile was the continuation of a practice that had been established by the time the clerk was born, encoded in the culture of the department, and transmitted through example rather than memo. This is how institutions bury inconvenient information in practice. Not through active suppression, but through the cultivation of a collective preference for not asking, for routing around, for sealing and moving on. Sydney's underground is the result of a century and a half of rooting around. Sandstone is an extraordinarily good archive. This is a fact that has become increasingly important in archaeology and geology over the last 3 decades, as new dating technologies have allowed researchers to establish the age of stone modifications with a precision that was previously impossible. Optically stimulated luminescence OSL dating can determine when a particular surface was last exposed to light, which in practice means it can tell you when a piece of stone was detached from its parent formation and when it was last disturbed. Uranium series dating can establish when carbonate deposits, thin layers of calcium carbonate that accumulate on surfaces exposed to percolating groundwater, were laid down, which gives you a minimum age for the underlying surface. Rock varnish microlamination dating can establish when the thin mineral deposits that accumulate on exposed stone surfaces in specific environmental conditions were formed. None of these methods are perfect. All of them have error ranges and conditions under which they produce unreliable results, but all of them are capable, under the right conditions, of distinguishing between a surface that was modified 10,000 years ago and a surface that was modified 200 years ago. And in the sandstone passages beneath Sydney passages with dry, stable environmental conditions that are precisely the conditions under which these dating methods produce their most reliable results. The application of these methods could, in principle, establish with considerable precision whether the modifications visible in the stone are pre-colonial or colonial. This has never been done. Not because the methods are unavailable, not because the expense is prohibitive. A detailed dating program for a selection of key sites would cost a fraction of what the city spends on any number of routine infrastructure studies. Not because the scientific expertise doesn't exist in Australia. There are researchers at Australian universities who have applied exactly these methods in other contexts. It has not been done because doing it would require first acknowledging that the sites exist, formally declaring them heritage significant, granting researchers access to sealed underground infrastructure, and engaging with the political and legal implications of what the results might show. And those implications are the real obstacle. If the dating program came back with a finding that the passages and chambers beneath Sydney were modified, occupied, or constructed by Gadigal or related people prior to European contact, that would constitute evidence of a level of architectural and engineering sophistication that challenges, in a very direct way, the historical narrative that has justified the colonial project and its consequences. It would not simply be an interesting archaeological finding. It would be a land rights finding. It would be a sovereignty finding. It would be a finding with implications for every current and future land use decision in the Sydney Basin. This is not a reason to avoid doing the research. It is exactly the reason why the research must be done, and done in genuine partnership with the communities whose history it concerns. But it is the reason why it has not been done. The institution that would have to authorize the investigation is also the institution that would have to live with the consequences. And that is a conflict of interest so fundamental that it has, for 150 years, produced exactly the archival pattern we are looking at. Seal, file, move on. Sydney's metro network, the high-frequency, driverless rail system that has been under construction in stages since the 2010s and continues to expand through the 2020s, represents the largest underground construction program in the city's history. Metro construction involves deep bores through exactly the geological zones that have generated anomalous reports since 1793. The tunnel boring machines that excavate the metro tunnels are equipped with sophisticated geological sensing technology that generates continuous data about the nature of the material being bored through. The engineers monitoring that data can detect, in real time, significant changes in the geological environment, including voids, including zones of anomalous porosity, including spaces that differ in character from the surrounding formation. The geotechnical reports from the metro construction are, in theory, public documents. Some of them are accessible through the Metro Authority's environmental and planning documentation, but they are large, technical documents written in language designed for engineers and geologists, and they are not cross-referenced against the historical record of pre-existing anomalies in any way that would make the comparison obvious to a non-specialist reader. When researchers have performed that cross-referencing, when they have taken the metro geotechnical data and overlaid it against the historical survey records and the Eastern Suburbs Railway Diary entries, what they find is a pattern that is, by now, familiar. In the zones where the pre-existing anomalies were previously noted, the metro geotechnical data contains entries that describe features consistent with those anomalies: zones of unexpected void space, unexpected absence of the debris and fill material that would be expected in natural void systems, unexpected regularity of passage profiles, and those entries are tagged with the designation "Further investigation not required." Further investigation not required, in a geotechnical report produced in the 2020s, using the technology of the 2020s, in a city with a declared commitment to heritage protection and reconciliation. The language has not changed in 150 years. The institutional preference has not changed. The anomalies are noted. The recommendation is to proceed. The question of what is actually there and who made it and when, and why that question is not asked. It is still not asked. The people who have taken this question seriously have not, for the most part, held institutional positions that gave them the authority to do anything about it. There is a heritage researcher. She has published 2 papers on this subject in peer-reviewed journals, and both papers are currently available through academic databases, though neither has received anything approaching the attention they merit. Her first paper, published in the early 2010s, was a careful archival study of the pre-colonial underground void records in Sydney, cross-referenced against the geological record and the colonial survey documentation. It was methodologically conservative. It drew no dramatic conclusions. It simply laid out, in the sober language of academic heritage research, the existence and pattern of the archival anomalies, and called for further investigation. The funding application she submitted alongside the paper was declined. Her second paper, published several years later, incorporated the Metro geotechnical data and the Eastern Suburbs Railway diary entries, and placed them in the context of the 1921 Public Works Report. It was more specific in its argument. It identified 3 zones, Town Hall, St. James, and the Paddington Reservoir area, as priority sites for subsurface heritage assessment. It described, in technical terms, the dating methods that could be applied and the cost and time scale of a properly designed investigation program. The funding application she submitted alongside the second paper was also declined. She continues to work on this. She is not a sensationalist. She is not someone who wants the answer to be dramatic. She is someone who looked at the archive, saw the pattern, and has spent more than a decade trying to get a serious conversation started. She has not succeeded, not in the sense of generating the formal investigation she is calling for, but she has built the evidentiary foundation. She has done the archival work. If the conversation ever begins, her papers are where it starts. Then there is the retired Metro engineer. He worked on the tunneling program from the late 1980s until his retirement, and he has, in retirement, been willing to speak to researchers in ways that he was not willing to speak during his career. He is careful. He speaks in the conditional. He says things like, "I would not rule out the possibility that some of the features we documented as geological anomalies had a different character than the geological designation suggested." He says things like, "There were conversations I was not part of, decisions I was not asked about, that seemed to have been made at a level above my pay grade." He does not make dramatic claims. He describes, with technical precision, a small number of specific instances in which the handling of underground anomalies during metro construction seemed to him inconsistent with normal geotechnical practice instances in which the standard protocol would have been to investigate further, and in which the decision was instead to seal and proceed. He is not a whistleblower. He has not gone to the press. He has spoken to a small number of researchers, and he has declined to allow his name to be used in publications. But his account corroborates, from direct professional experience, the pattern that the archival record describes from a distance. And then there are members of the Gadigal and broader Eora community who have been carrying knowledge of the underground significance of this country for the entirety of the colonial period, carrying it in the way that Indigenous communities across Australia have carried knowledge that colonial institutions were structurally incapable of receiving. In ceremony, in story, in the transmission of specifics across generations, despite the sustained colonial project of cultural destruction. Some of that knowledge is accessible to non-community members through the ethnographic record. More of it is not, and should not be, because it belongs to the community, and its transmission is governed by protocols that are not mine to override by discussing it in a YouTube video. What I can say is that when community members have engaged with the academic researchers who are working on this question, and some have the convergence between the archival record and the oral tradition has been described as striking, not in the dramatic sense of a perfect match between a written record and a story. In the quieter, more significant sense that the underground geography that the archival record partially describes aligns, in ways that are not easily explained by coincidence, with the geography of underground significance that the oral tradition maintains. That alignment is not proof. It is direction. It is the kind of convergence between independent sources that, in any properly functioning research environment, would be considered sufficient to justify a serious, properly resourced, community-partnered investigation. There is a moral question here that is separate from the evidentiary question, though the two are not unrelated. The evidentiary question is, what is beneath Sydney? Who made it? when. The moral question is, why has the answer to that question been systematically avoided for 150 years, and what does that avoidance say about the society that has been doing the avoiding? These questions are connected because the avoidance has not been neutral. It has not simply been a matter of bureaucratic inertia or limited research capacity, or the difficulty of accessing underground heritage sites in a dense urban environment. Those factors are real, but they do not explain the specific pattern we have been tracing, the pattern in which anomalies are noted and then not investigated, in which reports are filed in inaccessible locations, in which archive gaps cluster precisely against the zones of highest significance, in which the specific designation, further investigation not required, appears with such regularity across a span of nearly 2 centuries. That pattern is not an accident, it is a choice. A choice made, again and again, by institutions that understood, at some level, that investigation carried risk, not physical risk, but the risk of a finding that would complicate the narrative on which colonial land tenure and its descendants rest. Australia has been engaged in fits and starts, in a national conversation about truth and reconciliation, about what was done in the colonial period and its aftermath, about what recognition and repair look like, about how to hold the complexity of history without either sanitizing it or reducing it to a single story. That conversation has produced some genuine achievements and has in many areas stalled against the same institutional resistance that has kept the Sydney underground investigation unfunded for 2 decades. The underground question is not separate from that conversation. It is part of it. The possibility that the land beneath Sydney's CBD contains evidence of pre-colonial engineering and landscape modification at a level of sophistication that has never been formally acknowledged, that possibility is exactly the kind of question that a genuine truth-telling process would want to address. And the 1.5 centuries of systematic avoidance of that question is exactly the kind of institutional behavior that a genuine reconciliation process would want to examine. This is not about proving a particular version of history. It is about creating the conditions under which history can be honestly examined. The archive has given us enough to know that something is there. The geology has given us enough to know that what is there is likely very well preserved. The community oral tradition has given us enough to know that the question of underground significance is not a product of recent speculation, but a long-maintained knowledge. And the research tools exist to begin answering the question with the kind of precision and care that it deserves. What is missing is not evidence. What is missing is the institutional will to take the question seriously. Let me take a moment to talk about what preservation in the Hawkesbury Sandstone actually means, because it is one of the most important and least understood aspects of this question. When archaeologists talk about site preservation, they are talking about the probability that material evidence of human activity has survived the elapsed time since that activity occurred. In surface environments, this probability decreases over time in most conditions at a significant rate. Organic materials decompose. Stone tools are displaced by erosion and soil movement. Pigment in rock art fades under UV exposure and weathering. The archaeologically recoverable signal diminishes with every passing year. Underground environments are fundamentally different. In a closed underground space, particularly in a space within a well-jointed sandstone formation above the permanent water table, the processes that destroy surface archaeological evidence do not operate, or operate at a radically reduced rate. There is no UV exposure. There is no frost thaw weathering. The humidity is stable. The temperature is stable. Organic material in a sealed underground sandstone space in the right geological conditions can survive for extraordinary periods. Organic material has been recovered from natural sandstone caves in Australia that is dated to 60,000 years and older. What this means for the passages and chambers beneath Sydney is that if they contain any material evidence of human activity, any tool marks in the walls, any pigment, any organic material introduced by human use, any artifactual deposition. The probability that that evidence has survived is very high. Not certain. The geological record is never certain, but very high. This is, in a sense, the most remarkable aspect of this entire question. The evidence is not lost. The evidence is not degraded. The evidence is sitting in excellent preservation condition, in the dark, beneath one of the most densely urbanized environments in the country, waiting for someone to look. The argument for urgency is simple. The metro construction is ongoing. The pressure of urban development on the underground environment beneath Sydney will only increase. Every year of delay is a year in which the probability of inadvertent destruction of preserved heritage increases. The sites do not have formal heritage protection. They cannot be formally protected because they have never been formally acknowledged, which means they have no protection at all against the infrastructure decisions that are being made above them right now. Every tunneling decision made without reference to these sites is a decision made in ignorance of the heritage consequence. Some of those decisions will be benign, some will not. And once a site is destroyed by inadvertent tunneling or foundation work, the evidence it contains is gone in the way that evidence only becomes gone when it has been physically removed from the geological record. There is no recovery from that. There is no subsequent funding application that can undo it. The window for this investigation is not permanent. The city is not standing still while the institutional preference for not asking maintains itself. The city is growing. The tunnels are going deeper. The foundations are getting larger. And the sandstone that has been patiently holding whatever it is holding for all of this time does not have indefinite patience. It is worth considering, briefly, how other cities have handled equivalent discoveries. In Rome, the discovery of underground chambers during construction activity routinely triggers a halt to the construction, a heritage assessment, and in many cases, the incorporation of the discovered site into public access. The result being that Rome has dozens of underground heritage sites that are now tourist destinations, cultural resources, and subjects of ongoing scholarly study. The economic and cultural value of those sites to the city is incalculable. The initial discovery was inconvenient. The management of the inconvenience has been enormously beneficial. In Istanbul, the construction of a major rail crossing beneath the Bosphorus, the Marmaray project, encountered extraordinary Byzantine archaeological remains at the Yenikapi station site. The project was delayed for several years, while an emergency archaeological excavation, the largest in Turkish history, recovered thousands of artifacts and the remains of ancient ships and harbour infrastructure. The delay was costly. The discovery was described, at completion, as one of the most significant archaeological finds of the 20th century. In London, the construction of the Crossrail project generated more than 10,000 archaeological artifacts and the remains of hundreds of individuals from multiple historical periods. Crossrail incorporated a major public engagement program around the archaeological discoveries, producing books, exhibitions, educational resources, and significant academic publications. Sydney, to date, has produced none of this. Not because the underground record is less significant, the evidence suggests it is at least as significant, and potentially far more so, given the time depth and the preservation conditions. But because the institutional response to underground discovery in Sydney has been, consistently and for a century and a half, to seal and proceed, the comparison is not comfortable. The comparison is not meant to be comfortable. It is meant to illustrate that what is happening in Sydney, the refusal to engage with the underground heritage question, is not the inevitable outcome of building a modern city on a geologically complex site. It is a choice that other cities, faced with comparable situations, have made differently. A choice that Sydney's institutions could make differently right now, if they chose to. There is a particular quality to Sydney at night, when the harbour noise diminishes and the ferry engines quiet and the city settles into its overnight rhythm, that invites a different kind of attention to the place. You can stand on the Circular Quay esplanade at 2 in the morning and feel the depth of the place in a way that the busyness of the day prevents. The stone is there, beneath the pavement, below the services and the utilities and the compressed layers of construction history. 40 feet down, 60 feet down, older than any of the structures visible above it by orders of magnitude. And somewhere in that depth, the question this video has been circling remains open. What is down there? The honest answer is, we don't know. We have excellent evidence that something is there. We have a pattern of anomalous records spanning nearly 2 centuries. We have the geological assessment that confirms the physical possibility of excellent preservation. We have the oral tradition that confirms the cultural significance. We have the archival record of institutional avoidance that tells us, obliquely, that the question has been understood as significant by the people in the best position to investigate it and declined by those same people as too consequential to pursue. But we do not have the thing itself. We do not have the floor measurements, the dating results, the photographic record, the artifactual recovery, the material evidence that would transform this from a very carefully assembled pattern of suggestion into something that can be definitively known. What we have is the shape of a space that has not been entered in a very long time. A shape drawn in absence in archive gaps, in sealed passages, in funding applications declined, in engineering reports with findings filed and forgotten. That shape is precise enough to tell us that the investigation is not only possible but necessary. It is not precise enough to tell us what the investigation would find. And maybe that is the right place to end. Not with certainty, not with the satisfying arrival at a conclusion that resolves the question and allows you to file it away, but with the question itself, in full, with all of its historical weight and all of its present-day consequence. The sandstone beneath Sydney is holding something. The city built on top of it has been choosing, for a very long time, not to look. And every person who understands that a choice is being made, who can see the pattern in the archive, who can feel the weight of 65,000 years of presence in the stone, who recognizes the urgency of the heritage window closing year by year as the city grows. Every person who understands that has a role in making the alternative choice possible. The alternative choice is investigation. Proper, community-partnered, methodologically rigorous, publicly accountable investigation. It is possible. It is affordable. It is overdue by approximately 150 years. What it requires is the willingness to stop routing around and start asking. There is a craft dimension to this question that deserves more attention than it usually receives. Working sandstone, shaping it deliberately, removing material in controlled ways to produce specific forms is a skill. It requires knowledge of how the stone responds to tool use, which directions of cut are with the grain and which are against it, how to read the joint system to anticipate where the stone will fracture naturally and where it will need to be worked, how to manage the dust and debris of the work, how to support the ceiling of a space as you hollow it out, how to achieve a level floor in a material that has natural bedding plane irregularities. These are not simple skills. They are not skills that are acquired in a single generation. They are skills that accumulate over generations of practice, that are taught from practitioner to practitioner, that incorporate not just the mechanical knowledge of how to strike stone, but the conceptual understanding of why the purpose the work serves, the significance the space holds, the relationship between the work and the knowledge system within which it is embedded. The Hawkesbury sandstone is a good working stone for someone who knows it. It is fine-grained, relatively homogeneous within the bedding planes, and it can be worked with hard stone tools, quartzite, for example, which occurs naturally in the Sydney Basin to produce smooth, consistent surfaces. The joint system, which runs at consistent orientations through the formation, provides natural guidance for linear excavation. If you want to cut a passage in the direction of a joint plane, the stone itself will help you, fracturing along lines of weakness that run in the direction you want to go. What the 1862 surveyor described as level and smooth, as though by long use or deliberate working, is, from a sandstone working perspective, achievable with stone tools and sufficient time and knowledge. It is not achievable accidentally. A floor that is level across the span of a passage is the result of deliberate material removal over multiple working sessions, with continuous attention to level and to the structural stability of the ceiling above. It requires planning. It requires purpose. And in the Hawkesbury sandstone, it leaves permanent marks, tool traces in the stone surface. The particular texture of worked versus unworked rock, the geometric precision of angles and alignments that don't occur naturally. Those marks would still be there. If the passage is what the 1862 record describes, the evidence of how it was made is preserved in the stone itself, waiting for someone with the right training and the right access to read it. The archaeology of stone working is a mature discipline. There are researchers who can look at a stone surface and tell you, with considerable precision, what kind of tool was used, in what direction, with what force, and in some cases whether the work was done in a single session or across multiple sessions separated by time. The application of those methods to the passages beneath Sydney would tell us not just that the modification is anthropogenic, but something about the nature of the work, the tools, the technique, the organization of effort. That analysis has never been performed. The surfaces have never been accessible to someone with the training to perform it, but the information is there, encoded in the stone, patient in the dark. I want to be careful here, because this is the part of the question where it is easiest to overstep, to slide from what the evidence supports into what the imagination supplies, and to present the imagination as analysis. So let me be explicit. What follows is not a claim. It is an exploration of possibilities that are consistent with what is documented, undertaken in the spirit of the question rather than the spirit of the answer. The oral tradition of the Gadigal and related Eora groups maintains that the underground spaces were places of significance, ceremonial significance, in the broad sense of that term, which, in Aboriginal Australian knowledge systems, encompasses knowledge transmission, initiation, the maintenance of ancestral relationships, and the specific practices associated with particular sites and seasons. Significance of that kind, in the archaeological record of Aboriginal cultures across the continent, tends to be associated with specific physical characteristics, controlled access, acoustic properties, proximity to specific natural features, orientation with respect to celestial events or landscape features. The passages described in the archival record oriented north-northeast, at depth, with level floors and consistent heights, with dry and still air have some of those characteristics. The north-northeast orientation, specifically, appears consistently across multiple independent records spanning more than a century. That is a specific compass bearing, not a general direction, and it does not correspond to the primary joint directions in the Hawkesbury sandstone, which run predominantly north-northwest and east-northeast in this part of the basin. If the passages were following the natural joint system, they would not systematically orient north-northeast. The deliberate selection of that bearing suggests purpose. What purpose is consistent with a north-northeast bearing in this geographic location for a culture whose knowledge system is deeply oriented around seasonal celestial events? The northeast direction marks, in Sydney's latitude, the approximate direction of the midsummer sunrise, the southernmost point of the sun's rising point on the horizon, reached at the December solstice, which is the Australian summer. A passage oriented toward the winter sunrise would be consistent with a ceremonial function oriented around the solar calendar. I am not saying that is what these passages were for. I am saying that the orientation is consistent with that function, in a context where ceremonial orientation towards celestial events is well documented in the surface record of Aboriginal Australian cultures. The alignment is not proof, it is a direction for investigation. Similarly, the chambers, particularly the 1871 Paddington chamber, with its 30-foot square dimensions, 9-foot ceiling, and 2 passage openings, are consistent in scale and proportions with a kind of space that serves a gathering function rather than a storage or transit function. A 30-foot square space can accommodate a significant number of people. The two passage openings suggest controlled access entry through one, exit through the other, or access from two different directions, which in ceremonial contexts often has specific significance related to movement and transition. Again, this is possibility, not finding. The chamber might have been purely functional water management, for example, is not an implausible purpose for a large underground space in a sandstone formation. The two openings might relate to drainage rather than ceremony. Without investigation, we cannot know. But the question of what the chambers held is not unanswerable in principle. Investigation, properly designed and undertaken in genuine partnership with the communities whose knowledge system gives the spaces their context, could narrow the space of possibilities significantly. What we are missing is not the capacity to answer. What we are missing is the permission to ask. Let me describe as concretely as I can what a properly designed investigation of this question would look like. It would begin with a community consultation process, genuine consultation, not the performative kind that produces a sign-off before the real decisions have been made, but substantive engagement with Gadigal community members and the broader Eora network, designed to share what the archival record contains, to receive the community's knowledge about underground significance, and to jointly design the research questions and the methods. That process would need to be led by people with genuine relationships in those communities, who understand the protocols governing the sharing of different categories of knowledge, and who can ensure that the investigation serves community interests, rather than simply institutional ones. It would then proceed to archival work, the systematic, comprehensive review of every relevant archive that hasn't yet been subjected to a proper search. The State Records of New South Wales, the Mitchell Library, the National Archives of Australia, the specific institutional archives of the New South Wales Public Works Department, the Sydney Water Corporation, the Metro Authority, the various construction contractors who have worked on major underground projects in Sydney over the past century and a half. That archival work would produce a more complete picture of where the anomalies are, what depth and orientation they sit at, and what the historical record says about their character. Following the archival phase, the investigation would move to non-invasive remote sensing, ground-penetrating radar, seismic survey methods, muon tomography, microgravity measurement. These are methods that can be applied from the surface or from existing underground access points without requiring new excavation. They would produce images of what is in the ground beneath the identified zones, images that would either confirm or deny the presence of the voids that the historical record describes, and that would give the investigation a physical map to work from. Remote sensing results in hand, the investigation would move to targeted access, not large-scale excavation, not the kind of broad intervention that carries high heritage destruction risk. Targeted entry into the best preserved accessible voids, with full documentation, photographic, three-dimensional scanning, material sampling for dating and analysis conducted by a team that includes archaeologists, geologists, Indigenous knowledge holders, and heritage specialists. The findings of that work would be shared with the community, with the public, in the academic literature, and in the Heritage Register. Whatever the sites are, whatever they contain, whatever their origin and purpose and age turn out to be, that information belongs in the public record. The entire process, designed properly, would take between 3 and 5 years, and would cost a fraction of what is spent each year on routine urban infrastructure studies. The cost per finding per unit of historical knowledge recovered would be negligible compared to almost any other heritage investigation currently being conducted in Australia. It has not been done because the first step, genuine community consultation, requires the city's institutions to approach the Gadigal community not as stakeholders to be managed, but as primary knowledge holders, partners. That requires a relationship that currently does not exist in the terms that would make the investigation possible. Building that relationship is the real work. Everything else follows from it. Sydney is a city that knows, better than most, how to present itself. The harbour is genuinely spectacular, the sandstone is genuinely beautiful. The cafe on the corner, where the light comes through just right in the late afternoon, is genuinely good. The city is not a fiction. It is a real place, and it is a place with real qualities that people rightly love. But cities, like people, carry their histories in ways that are not always visible on the surface. The things that have been buried not just literally in the stone, but institutionally in the archive, in the collective preference for not asking those things, do not stay buried forever. They do not dissipate. They do not lose their reality simply because the official record has declined to acknowledge them. They accumulate. They become the pressure that drives the need for truth-telling and recognition and repair. There is something beneath Sydney. It was there before the city arrived. It was there when the first colonial crews sealed their first anomalous record and moved on to the next task. It was there when the city circle tunnelers routed their alignment away from it. It was there when the Eastern Suburbs Railway crew sealed the passage at St. James and maintained an 11-day silence in their diary. It was there when the Metro Geotechnical Report marked the zone as requiring no further investigation. It is still there. Sandstone is patient in a way that human institutions are not. It does not require acknowledgement. It does not need the question to be asked in order to continue holding what it holds. It will wait for as long as it takes, 10 years, 50 years, another 150 years in the dark, in the dry, still air that the 1,980 diary entry described, in the condition of excellent preservation that the geology guarantees. The urgency is not the stones. The urgency is ours. The urgency belongs to the people who understand that the investigation is possible, that the heritage window is closing as the city grows, that the communities whose history this is deserve to have the question answered rather than avoided. The urgency belongs to anyone who has listened to this for however long you've been listening, and who feels, somewhere in the quiet of this late hour, the weight of what it means to live in a city that has been choosing for a very long time not to look at what it's built on. Not looking is a choice. Looking is also a choice. The sandstone is patient. The question remains open. The investigation is possible. And that, right now, at this hour, in whatever room or bed or dark corner you are listening from, is enough to know. If you made it this far through all of it, through the sandstone and the archive gaps and the sealed passages and the 11-day diary silence, then you already know that you are exactly the kind of person who finds the quiet questions more interesting than the loud answers. That is a good thing to know about yourself. It means the next video is already going to pull you in before it even starts. If you haven't subscribed yet, tonight's a good night for that. Not because it changes anything about the sandstone or the sealed passages or the institutional pattern we've been tracing, but because it keeps the thread going, the slow, careful, patient thread of these questions that don't resolve cleanly, that stay with you in the way that only the real ones do. Sleep well. The city outside is quieter than it looks, and somewhere beneath it, in the dry, still dark, the stone is holding whatever it's holding, just as it has been, every night, for a very long time. The question of what Sydney is built on geologically, historically, morally, is a question that the city has been deferring for as long as it has existed. Deferral has costs. Those costs compound. And the most significant cost is not financial, and it is not political. The most significant cost is the loss of knowledge, the potential irretrievable loss of a record that, once destroyed by inadvertent construction, cannot be recovered by any amount of subsequent will or funding or regret. Let us think about what that means in concrete terms. The St. James Passage that the Eastern Suburbs Railway Diary described in September 1988 to 12 feet high, 7 feet wide, dry and still, explored for 40 feet, and then sealed, has now been sealed for more than 40 years. In those 40 years, a heritage investigation of that passage has not been conducted, a formal archaeological assessment has not been commissioned, a remote sensing survey of the area around it has not been undertaken. The passage sits, sealed, beneath a major urban railway station, in exactly the geological conditions that the research literature tells us are optimal for the preservation of stone surface modifications, pigment, and organic material. What is in those 40 feet that were explored? What is beyond the point at which the crew turned back? We do not know. We cannot know without looking. And every year that passes without looking is a year in which the probability that someone else's infrastructure decision will inadvertently disturb the site increases by some small but non-zero amount. The metro extensions planned and under construction in the 2020s involve tunneling in the eastern CBD corridor. The exact routing of those tunnels passes, in some sections, through the geological zones of interest. The geotechnical reporting, as we have discussed, continues to flag and close anomalous features without triggering heritage investigation. The cumulative effect of that pattern, the compounding of small deferral decisions over time, in an environment of increasing underground infrastructure pressure, is a rising probability of inadvertent destruction. It is a probability that the current institutional framework is not designed to measure, because the framework does not formally acknowledge the existence of the heritage resource that is at risk. You cannot protect what you have not acknowledged. That is not a bureaucratic observation. It is a statement about the logical structure of heritage protection regimes. A site that is not in the heritage register has no heritage protection. A site that has not been formally assessed cannot be entered into the heritage register. A site that cannot be formally assessed because the institutions responsible for assessment have a 2-century-long habit of declining to investigate that site is, for all practical, legal and planning purposes, invisible. The invisibility is not a natural condition, it is a maintained condition. And maintaining it has required, over the course of 150 years, a continuous institutional effort, not a dramatic effort, not a conspiratorial effort, but the mundane daily effort of not asking, of routing around, of filing in inaccessible locations, of employing the designation "further investigation not required" as a tool for maintaining the status quo. That maintained invisibility is also a choice. And it is a choice that can be unmade. The history of what happened to Indigenous heritage in Australia in the 2 centuries following colonisation is, in most places, a history of destruction so thorough that the primary research strategy has had to shift from recovery to reconstruction. Surface sites, middens, scarred trees, ceremonial grounds, engravings, paintings were destroyed in the process of colonial land use, so systematically that the record of the pre-colonial landscape is deeply fragmentary. Researchers working on pre-colonial Aboriginal heritage in most parts of Australia are working from fragments. They are assembling pictures from the pieces that survived the clearance, the burning, the ploughing, the building over. Sydney is, in this respect, among the worst affected places in the country. The intensity of colonial land use in the Sydney Basin from the earliest years of settlement was extreme. The demands of a growing colonial city on the landscape left very little surface heritage intact in the urban core. The sandstone engravings in the surrounding national parks, the coastal rock art sites, the surviving middens, these are the heritage of the Sydney Basin, that persisted precisely because they were far enough from the colonial centre to escape the most intensive phase of destruction. What may have persisted in the urban core, what may have survived the 200 years of intense development because it was underground, protected by the very stone that made the surface so attractive to colonial builders, is the underground record, the passages, the chambers, the worked surfaces, the material that was introduced into those spaces before European contact and has been sitting in optimal preservation conditions in the dark beneath the city ever since. If that is true, if the underground heritage of pre-colonial Sydney has survived in a condition that surface heritage could not, then the significance of what may be down there is not simply archaeological. It is the difference between having a heritage and not having one. It is the difference between the Gadigal community having access to physical, datable, material evidence of their presence and their sophistication in this country, and having only the oral tradition powerful and true, but not legible to legal and administrative processes that require material evidence of a kind that courts and heritage bodies can assess. The stakes are that large. This is not a question about interesting ancient history. It is a question about living people, community members, who are navigating complex legal and cultural landscapes in which the material evidence of their connection to country is a meaningful factor, and who deserve to have access to whatever evidence of that connection exists in a recoverable form. The underground heritage, if it is what the archival record and the oral tradition suggest it is, belongs to those communities in a sense more fundamental than ownership. It is their history, encoded in the stone of their country, waiting to be formally acknowledged and protected. The decision to not look has been made by institutions. The people most affected by that decision have had little power to reverse it. That is not an unusual situation in Australian heritage management. It is, in fact, a defining characteristic of the colonial heritage management regime, which was built to manage the cultural property of the colonizing population and has only very slowly and imperfectly been adapted to the needs of the colonized. But it is a situation that the current generation of heritage managers, archaeologists, government officials, and city administrators have the capacity to change. They have not yet changed it. But the capacity is there. There is something that needs to be said about the role of pattern recognition in this investigation that I have been building toward for a while now, and that I want to address directly. The case that this video is making is not based on a single dramatic piece of evidence. It is not based on the discovery of a sealed door, or a map, or a document that explicitly states there is a pre-colonial city beneath Sydney. No such document exists. And if it did, this video would have started with it rather than spending an hour building toward the pattern. The case is based on pattern, and pattern-based arguments are legitimately subject to a specific kind of skeptical challenge, the challenge that says, you have assembled a collection of individually explainable data points and attributed collective significance to their convergence, but convergence alone does not establish cause. Individual anomalies may have individual natural explanations that collectively appear connected only because you are looking for connections. That challenge is worth taking seriously. Let me address it directly. The pattern we have been tracing consists of the following elements: anomalous underground void records in the Sydney CBD and eastern suburbs dating from 1793 to the present, spanning 6 distinct historical periods and multiple independent institutional sources. A consistent characterization of specific physical features, level floors, consistent height, smooth walls, dry still air, north-northeast, orientation across records that cannot have been influenced by each other, given that the records were produced by different actors in different periods and that several of them were not in accessible locations when subsequent records were produced, a geological assessment that confirms that the described features are inconsistent with natural void formation in the Hawkesbury sandstone, an archival gap pattern that is non-random and clusters against the identified anomaly zones, and against the periods of highest underground construction activity, a consistent institutional response of sealing and declining investigation, and an oral tradition maintained by the Gadigal community that describes underground significance in ways that the archival record partially corroborates. The skeptical challenge requires that each of these elements have an independent natural explanation that is not connected to the others. The geological explanation for the physical features is not available. The geology says those features should not be there if the voids are natural. The archival gap pattern is not explained by the general incompleteness of historical records, the gaps cluster 2 specifically. The oral tradition is not explained by cultural accident. Its convergence with the physical record is too specific. What remains for the skeptic to argue is that multiple independent sources, across multiple historical periods, have independently described the same non-natural features in the same locations for reasons that have nothing to do with those features actually being there. That argument is not impossible, but it is increasingly implausible with each additional independent source that is added to the pattern. And the pattern, at this point, consists of a very large number of independent sources. The epistemically responsible position is not to say, this is proven. It is to say, the pattern of evidence is sufficiently strong and internally consistent to justify formal investigation, and the failure to conduct that investigation requires explanation. That is the argument this video is making, and it is an argument that, so far as I have been able to find, has not been credibly challenged on its merits. It has been ignored, defunded, routed around, but not challenged. I want to spend some time on the specific question of the 1921 Public Works Report, because it is the document that, more than any other in the archival record, makes the rest of the pattern interpretively coherent. The report is an internal document produced for internal administrative purposes, not for public distribution. This matters because internal documents tend to be more candid than public ones. There is no audience management in an internal report. There is no need to frame findings in a way that avoids public alarm or political complication. The audience is other government engineers and administrators, and the purpose is to communicate findings clearly and recommend action. The 1921 report communicates its findings clearly. In two zones, Town Hall and the southeastern section approaching Circular Quay construction crews for the City Circle Railway encountered pre-existing voids of a character inconsistent with natural joint-controlled formation. The report does not speculate about origin. It does not suggest who made the voids, or when, or why. It simply notes their existence. Notes that they exceed what natural formation would produce, notes that the project engineers elected to route the tunnels to avoid them, and notes that the features were sealed where the construction disturbed them. And then it recommends that the features be noted in the geological record but not made the subject of further investigation. That recommendation is remarkable. It is not recommending investigation, it is not recommending public disclosure. It is not recommending that heritage authorities be notified. It is recommending that the features be noted and that the notation be filed in a way that does not attract investigation. Why? The report does not explain the recommendation. Internal reports often do not explain recommendations. The reasoning is assumed to be understood by the intended audience. But the structure of the recommendation makes the reasoning implicit. You recommend noting without investigating when you understand that investigation would be consequential, and when you prefer the consequence of not knowing to the consequence of knowing. The 1921 report's recommendation reflects an institutional understanding present in the room, not needing to be stated that formal investigation of these features would produce findings with implications that the institution was not prepared to manage. What implications? In 1921, the most consequential implication of a finding of pre-existing engineered voids beneath Sydney would have been the challenge to the terra nullius doctrine that underpinned the entire colonial land tenure system. Terra nullius, the legal fiction that Australia was unoccupied at the time of British settlement, that there was no prior sovereignty, no prior use that would complicate the assertion of Crown ownership, was the legal foundation on which everything built in Sydney rested. Material evidence of sophisticated pre-colonial engineering beneath the city would have been directly incompatible with that doctrine. Terra nullius was not formally rejected by Australian law until the Mabo decision in 1992. In 1921, it was the unquestioned legal and ideological foundation of colonial Australia. A government engineer who understood what pre-existing engineered voids beneath Sydney implied for terra nullius, and the engineers of 1921 were not naive. They were educated men who understood the legal and political landscape, would have had strong institutional reasons to recommend exactly what the 1921 report recommended. Note: file. Do not investigate. Mabo was decided in 1992. Terra nullius is no longer the legal foundation of Australian land tenure. The legal landscape has changed fundamentally. The 1921 recommendation was produced in response to a legal and political context that no longer exists in the same form. The reason for the recommendation has, to a significant degree, been superseded by subsequent legal developments. And yet the pattern continues. The 2003 Geotechnical Survey, the Metro reports, the designation, further investigation not required. The context has changed, the pattern has not. That tells you something about the degree to which institutional patterns are self-sustaining. The original reason for the pattern no longer operates with the same force, but the pattern continues because it has become the culture, because the culture rewards rooting around, because the professional cost of raising the question, even in a post-Mabo legal environment, is higher than the professional cost of staying quiet. That cost differential needs to change. It will change when the people in a position to raise the question understand that raising it is professionally supported rather than professionally penalized. It will change when the heritage framework formally acknowledges the underground record. It will change when the funding applications stop being declined. None of that change happens on its own. Change of that kind requires people, researchers, community members, journalists, policy advocates, people with enough understanding of what is at stake to make the argument in the rooms where decisions get made to persist. I have been talking about sealed passages and archive gaps in geotechnical reports for a very long time now, and I want to take a step back from the specific evidence and sit for a moment with what it means emotionally, morally, in the way that things mean things when you are lying in the dark at this hour and the rational analysis has settled and what's left is the feeling. What it means is this. There are people whose ancestors built something in the stone beneath one of the most densely inhabited places in this country. And those people, the descendants, living now, today, in Sydney and across the country, have been asking, in various ways for various lengths of time, to have the existence of what their ancestors built formally acknowledged, not celebrated, not sensationalized, acknowledged, investigated, returned to the heritage record from which 2 centuries of institutional avoidance have kept it absent. That is not a complex request. It is the most basic request that a community can make of the heritage management institutions of the country where they live. We have reason to believe something is here. Please look. And the answer, again and again, in the form of funding applications declined and investigation recommendations overruled and geotechnical designations that close questions without opening them, has been no. The word no does not appear in the record. The record is more subtle than that. The record says, further investigation not required and no action and geological anomaly, sealed, proceed. But the functional meaning of all of those phrases, in the context of what is being asked, is no. The reasons for the no have evolved over time. In 1793, it was practical urgency they needed to build. In 1862, it was the survey mandate. They were mapping drainage, not heritage. In 1921, it was terra nullius. The legal and political cost of knowing was prohibitive. In 1980, it was a tunneling project, under cost pressure, with a timeline to meet. In 2003, it was geotechnical practice. The software produces a designation and the engineer accepts it. In the 2020s, it is a complex institutional landscape in which heritage, planning, rail authority, and community consultation processes are each managed separately by agencies with different mandates and no incentive to bridge the gap that sits between them. The reasons change. The answer does not. And I am sitting with that tonight, at this hour, in whatever the equivalent of the dark between the floor and the ceiling is when you are inside a video rather than inside a building. The answer has not changed for 230 years. That is a long time to maintain a preference for not asking. The sandstone is 40 feet down. The passage is still there. The door, literal or metaphorical, is still sealed, and the question is still unanswered, in a way that is not an accident, and has not been an accident for a very long time. Let me tell you about the light in Hawkesbury sandstone country at a specific time of year. In late December, around the time of the summer solstice, the longest day in the southern hemisphere, the peak of the Australian summer, the sun rises in Sydney at its southernmost point on the horizon. It rises, in rough terms, to the northeast. Not due north, not due east, northeast. And the particular quality of that solstice sunrise light in sandstone country does something to the stone that the rest of the year's light does not quite replicate. It turns the stone orange. Not the everyday honey gold of Sydney sandstone in afternoon light, but a deep, warm orange that seems to come from inside the stone rather than from above it, as though the stone itself were producing light rather than receiving it. People have noticed this for a long time, not just in Sydney. Across the continent, the relationship between solstice light and sandstone in Australia is documented in the rock art record alignment of engravings with the strategic placement of sites in landscape positions that are explained by their relationship to the sun at specific points in the annual cycle. This is not speculation. It is documented in the peer-reviewed literature. Australian Aboriginal cultures, across an enormous geographic range and across tens of thousands of years, oriented significant sites in relation to celestial events with a precision and deliberateness that required not just observation but multi-generational transmission of precise knowledge. The idea that the Gadigal people, inhabiting a sandstone landscape for 65,000 years, would not have developed an equivalent understanding of how solstice light interacts with their specific stone, that they would not have incorporated that knowledge into the placement and orientation of significant sites runs. Contrary to everything that the archaeological and ethnographic record tells us about how sophisticated this relationship between country and cosmology is, and the north-northeast orientation that appears consistently across multiple independent records of underground passages beneath Sydney, that orientation is consistent with a designed relationship to the December solstice sunrise. I want to be careful not to claim more than the evidence supports. The orientation alone does not prove ceremonial purpose. It is consistent with it. It is one of several lines of evidence that point in the same direction without individually constituting proof. But the question it raises is one I find genuinely moving, in the way that the best historical questions are moving. Imagine a passage cut through sandstone, oriented to the northeast, designed so that the solstice sunrise would shine directly into its length for a matter of minutes once a year. Imagine the light entering the passage, that particular December orange light, and traveling the length of the stone floor to whatever the passage contains, whatever it was made to hold or to illuminate or to transform. Imagine that passage sitting, in the dark, for 65,000 years of solstices, and then for another 230 years, with a concrete seal at its opening, and a city built above it. The light still rises in the northeast in December. It always will. The stone is still there. The passage, if it is oriented as the records suggest, still receives exactly the same light that it was designed to receive, falling on a sealed wall rather than entering an open passage. That is a thought that I find very difficult to complete without feeling the weight of what has been interrupted. There are people in Sydney who know more about this than I have been able to tell you. There are Gadigal elders who carry, in the form in which knowledge is carried across generations in their tradition, specifics about the underground that I do not have access to and should not claim to relay. What I can tell you is that the knowledge exists. It has existed throughout the colonial period, maintained in the face of sustained assault on every institution through which it might have been transmitted, surviving, because knowledge of that importance is not surrendered simply because the surface conditions make its maintenance dangerous. Knowledge that has been maintained for 65,000 years does not stop at colonization. It finds new forms, new carriers, new ways of persisting, There are researchers in Australian universities who have been working on aspects of this question for years in archaeology, in heritage management, in Indigenous studies, in geology, in archival history. Some of them are in direct conversation with each other. Some of them are working independently on parts of the problem without full visibility of what the others have found. The field is fragmented in the way that research fields become fragmented when the central question is institutionally uncomfortable. When the obvious synthesis is not produced, because the obvious synthesis is not what the funding environment rewards. The synthesis exists, the data exists, the methodology for investigating exists. The community partnerships that would make investigation appropriate and legitimate can be built. What is missing is the formal recognition, the moment when the institution that has the power to say yes to a properly designed investigation says yes. That moment has not arrived. But the preparation for it has been underway for a long time. And in the meantime, the archive is there, the Mitchell Library is there, the state records are there, the published papers are there, findable through academic databases, by anyone with the patience to look. The information this video has drawn on is not secret. It is simply scattered, embedded in technical documents and academic publications and institutional archives that are not structured for easy public access, but that are, in principle, accessible. The question has not been suppressed. It has been inconvenienced. Those are different things. Inconvenience can be overcome by persistence. And the persistence of the researchers who have been working on this, of the community members who have been maintaining the knowledge, of the people who have been making funding applications and writing papers and reading Eastern Suburbs Railway diaries until they find the entry that says, outstanding, that persistence is itself a form of testimony. It says, this matters. It says, the question is real. It says, we are not going away. Sandstone does not go away either. That is perhaps its most important quality, and the quality that makes the underground record, in some ways, the most resilient archive that Sydney possesses. Everything on the surface has changed beyond recognition. The sandstone below has not. What was placed there, or shaped there, or worked there, it waits in exactly the condition in which it was left. Patient, quiet, available to anyone who is given the access to look. The concept of deep time is one that geology makes available to us, and that very few of us are equipped by our everyday experience to actually inhabit. Deep time is not long time. Long time is the time you experience when a meeting is running over, when a delayed flight stretches into its 4th hour, when the year you are in feels longer than the years that came before. Long time is experienced. Deep time is not. Deep time is the time of geological process, the time of mountain formation and erosion, of sea floor spreading, of the deposition of sedimentary layers, one grain at a time over millions of years. It is a time so vast that it cannot be made experiential in the way that ordinary time is experiential. It can only be gestured at. The Hawkesbury sandstone was deposited 240 million years ago. That sentence is available to you as a fact, but the reality it points to, the reality of 240 million years of time, each second of which passed with the same duration as the second you are currently in, the reality of 240 million years of geological process that produced the specific grain size and cross-bedding and joint pattern of the stone that sits 40 feet beneath Sydney right now, that reality is not available to you as experience. It is too large for experience. It exceeds the imaginative capacity that evolution has given us. The Gadigal people have been in relationship with that stone for 65,000 years. 65,000 years is not deep time. 65,000 years is a duration that human beings have. In principle, the imaginative capacity to approach it is 3,000 generations, approximately, each of which lived a full human life with full human relationship and full human experience of the country they inhabited. 3,000 generations of full knowledge of this stone. 3,000 generations of understanding how to read the joint system, how to work the surface, how to navigate the underground, how to inhabit the relationship between the surface world and the stone below it. 3,000 generations of oral transmission of that knowledge, with the kind of precision and reliability that 65,000 years of unbroken continuity makes possible. And then colonization, which did not erase that knowledge. It is not erasable. It is too deeply encoded in the culture that carries it, but which severed the institutional pathways through which that knowledge might have been formally recorded and formally received by the governmental and academic institutions that now manage the heritage questions it speaks to. The severing is not permanent. It can be re-established. The knowledge is still there. The institutions are still there. The question of how they meet, how the knowledge system that has been maintained for 65,000 years connects with the formal heritage management system that has been in place for a few decades is a live question with a live process attached to it, happening now, in the present, imperfectly and unevenly but happening. The Sydney Underground question is a specific, concrete, geographically bounded version of that general question. It is a place where the meeting might happen in a way that produces something knowledge, material, a heritage record that belongs to both. I want to take one more pass at the institutional question, because I think it is easy to hear institutional avoidance as an accusation, and I want to be precise about what I mean and what I do not mean. What I am describing is not a conspiracy. I am not describing a group of people who gathered in a room and decided to suppress the evidence of a pre-colonial underground city for political reasons. Real historical processes are almost never that clean, and this one is not. What I am describing is a culture that formed very early in the colonial period, when the practical urgency of building a functional settlement meant that anomalous underground features were dealt with as engineering problems rather than heritage questions. A culture that persisted through the 19th century, when terra nullius was the unquestioned legal framework, and the implications of pre-colonial engineering for that framework were understood, implicitly, as a reason not to investigate. A culture that survived into the 20th century through the momentum of institutional precedent, through the accumulated weight of the fact that this was how the thing was done, and changing how it was done would require acknowledging that it had been done that way, and acknowledging that carried its own complications. Cultures of this kind are self-sustaining, not because anyone is actively enforcing them, but because they shape the incentives of the people who work within them. The engineer who surfaces an anomaly and files it under no further action is not suppressing evidence. She is following professional practice. She is doing what the format and the culture and the precedent of her field tells her to do. She may not know the history of the pattern. She may not have read the 1,862 survey note or the 1,921 Public Works report. She is simply applying the professional standard that was transmitted to her by the culture she works in. That is both an exculpation and an indictment. It exculpates individuals. It indicts the culture. And the culture is changeable. Not easily, not quickly, but changeable. It changes when the professional incentives change. It changes when the formal heritage framework changes to include underground pre-colonial sites. It changes when funding applications for investigation of those sites succeed rather than failing. It changes when the researchers who raise the question receive support rather than silence. The people who have been raising the question have been doing so in a culture that does not reward them for it. They have been doing it anyway. That matters. That is how cultures begin to change, through the persistence of the people who keep acting as though the culture they want already exists, until enough of them are doing it that it becomes the culture. The heritage researcher, with 2 declined funding applications, is acting as though a culture exists in which this investigation is valued. The retired metro engineer who speaks to researchers in retirement is acting as though a culture exists in which professional accountability extends beyond the scope of one's employment. The community members who maintain and share the oral tradition in the context of formal heritage processes are acting as though a culture exists in which their knowledge is receivable. They are building that culture by acting as though it exists. That is also a form of patience. There is one more document I want to tell you about before we close. It is not a dramatic document. It is not a secret document. It is a planning assessment, one of the thousands of planning assessments produced each year for development proposals in the Sydney metropolitan area. This one was produced for a development proposal in the inner CBD, and it is available through the New South Wales Planning Portal, accessible to anyone with the time and the knowledge to look for it. The relevant section of the assessment notes that the development site lies within a geological zone identified in historical records as containing subsurface void features. It notes that the historical records are non-specific regarding the nature and extent of those features. It recommends that the development proceed with a geotechnical investigation of the subsurface, and that the geotechnical investigation include a heritage impact assessment in the event that void features are encountered during construction. In the event that void features are encountered during construction, not before, not as a precondition of the development proceeding, not in the way that a proper heritage assessment would be structured, with investigation preceding development rather than responding to what the development happens to disturb. In the event, that phrase represents the current state of the formal framework for managing underground heritage in Sydney. The investigation happens, if it happens at all, in response to inadvertent discovery during construction, rather than as a design precondition that would allow the discovery to be managed with proper care and proper recording and proper community involvement. In the event that void features are encountered, the crew stops, the heritage officer is called, the brief investigation window opens in the context of a construction timeline that is already under pressure, the decision is made about what to do with what has been found, and the project proceeds. That is the process. That is the best that the formal heritage management framework currently offers for the underground record of pre-colonial Sydney, and it is not adequate. It is not adequate for the complexity of what might be found. It is not adequate for the significance of what is at stake. And it is not adequate for the communities whose history is the primary interest at issue. The framework needs to change. The change requires political will, which requires public attention, which requires the question to be understood by people outside the academic and professional heritage community as genuinely important and genuinely urgent. That is why I am making this video. Not because I have new evidence, not because I am claiming certainty that goes beyond what the archive supports, but because the question is important enough and urgent enough and long enough deferred that the more people who understand it, the better the chance that the institutional threshold for acting on it finally shifts. The sandstone is patient, but we do not have to be. It is very late now, and the video has run long. And I want to use the time that remains to be as clear as I can about what I am actually asking you to hold as you fall asleep. I am not asking you to believe that a spectacular ancient city is buried beneath Sydney. The evidence does not support that characterization, and the characterization would actually do harm. It would be sensationalism in a context where sensationalism is the enemy of the serious investigation that is needed. The passages and chambers described in the archive are real and significant, and likely to be profoundly important for what they tell us about the people who made them and the knowledge they represent. But they are not a city in any sense that implies urban scale or population centers or the kind of civilizational complexity that the word city normally carries. What I am asking you to hold is something more precise and more interesting than that. I am asking you to hold the image of a passage, cut through sandstone oriented north-northeast, 8 to 12 feet high, with a level floor and dry still air, sitting 40 feet beneath a major urban railway station, sealed since 1980, undisturbed for 45 years, in geological conditions that the research literature tells us are optimal for the preservation of whatever it contains. I'm asking you to hold the image of the heritage researcher who has filed 2 funding applications and had 2 declined, and who is still working on this, because the archive told her something real and she has not found a way to stop thinking about it. I'm asking you to hold the image of the Gadigal elders who carry, in forms that I cannot fully access and you cannot fully access from a video, knowledge of what the underground means to this country, knowledge that has been waiting, patiently, for the formal acknowledgement that would allow it to be brought into contact with the material evidence that the stone is holding. And I am asking you to hold the image of the archive itself, the gap-filled, unevenly catalogued, institutionally inconvenient archive of Sydney's underground, with its 1,793 drainage note, and its 1,862 level floor, and its 1,921 internal recommendation, and its 1,980 diary entry, with the 11-day silence after the word outstanding and archive. That does not tell a simple story, but that tells, unmistakably, the shape of a question that has been waiting for a very long time to be taken seriously. That question is the city you are above. That question is the stone you are separated from by however many floors and foundations and sealed passages lie between you and the level that the Triassic Formation occupies. That question is 40 feet down, in the dark, in excellent preservation, patient in the way that only stone can be patient. And it will still be there tomorrow. Sydney is not unique in having buried its questions. Every city built on someone else's country has done the same. The burial is not architectural. The burial is institutional, the deliberate or habitual cultivation of not knowing, of routing around, of sealing the passage and moving on, because what the passage leads to is too consequential to face. What makes Sydney potentially unusual is not the burial. It is the possibility that what was buried has survived. Most cities that have buried their questions have buried them under conditions that guarantee the destruction of the evidence. Intensive cultivation, water saturation, chemical contamination, repeated construction cycles that turn the ground over and over until there is nothing left below that was there at the beginning. In Sydney, the Hawkesbury Sandstone Formation does not behave that way. It is stable, it is dry where it needs to be dry, it is aerated. It is the kind of geological environment in which the evidence of what was there at the beginning, if it was placed in the stone rather than on the soil above it, has an extraordinary chance of having survived. That is the reason for the urgency. That is the reason why 230 years of institutional avoidance has not yet produced the worst outcome. Physical destruction of the heritage resource, even though it has produced every other kind of harm. The stone has been patient in a way that has kept the evidence intact despite the institutional preference for its irrelevance. But the stone's patience is not infinite, in the sense that the city's growth is not infinite. The metro is extending. The basements are getting deeper. The subsurface environment of the inner Sydney CBD is under more construction pressure now than at any point in the city's history, and that pressure will increase. There will come a point, not tomorrow, maybe not in 10 years, but within a definite future when the construction activity will intersect with the anomaly zones in a way that is destructive rather than merely adjacent. At that point, the window closes. The evidence that the sandstone has been holding through 2 centuries of institutional avoidance is gone. And the question, whose country? Who built this? What knowledge was encoded here? What was the relationship between the surface and the underground? In the ceremonial geography of the Gadigal people, that question loses its best chance of being answered by material evidence. The window's open now. It will not stay open. That is the factual state of the question at the moment when this video is reaching you. Wherever you are, whatever time it is, in the quiet of whatever hour this is for you. The sandstone is 40 feet down. The passage is still there. The question is still open. Let me tell you about what silence sounds like. Underground. Natural silence, the silence of open wilderness, of places genuinely remote from human activity, is not the absence of sound. It is the presence of the sound of wind, and insects, and water movement, and the structural creak of the living world. It has texture. It shifts. The silence of a sealed underground space is different. It is the absence of texture. It is the silence of a space from which all of those sources of sound have been removed, not by distance, but by enclosure. It is a silence that has a physical weight to it, that presses against the ear in the way that pressure presses against the body at depth. It is the silence of time that has passed in a confined space, rather than across an open one. The September 1980 diary entry describes the air in the St. James Passage as dry and still, not moving. Underground voids connected to the surface through permeable rock tend to have air movement. The thermal differential between the underground environment and the surface environment drives a slow circulation. A void with still air is a void that is closed, isolated from the surface connection that would drive circulation. A void with still air in 1980 was a void that had been closed for long enough that the air inside had equilibrated to the surrounding rock temperature and was no longer subject to the thermal drive that produces circulation. How long does that take? It depends on the size of the space and the degree of closure. In a space of the dimensions described 8 to 12 feet high, 7 feet wide, explored for 40 feet with no termination visible, the equilibration of air temperature to rock temperature typically takes on the order of years, rather than months or decades. The air in that passage, in September 1980, had been still for years. The closure that produced that stillness had been in place for at least years before the 1980 crew broke through to it. The Eastern Suburbs Railway tunneling ran from 1974 to 1979. The tunnels in this section did not disturb the passage, the diary entry records breaking through to it, which implies an encounter, not a prior intersection. If the passage had been sealed by earlier railway construction, the air inside would have been sealed at the time of that sealing, in whatever condition it was then in. The City Circle railway tunneling that ran through this zone passed in the 1920s. 50 years of sealed still air in a dry sandstone environment with stable temperature and no biological activity to speak of. The silence that the 1980 crew encountered had been building since before anyone in that crew was born. What does it feel like to step into a space in which the air has not moved for 50 years? In which the last sound was the noise of construction sealing the passage above? The diary entry uses the word outstanding. It uses that word with underlines in a handwritten log maintained by a shift supervisor on a tunneling project who was, in all probability, not given to literary effect. He was describing something he experienced. He was reaching for the word that fit the experience of entering a space that had been quiet for 50 years, with a floor that looked like a floor and air that had not moved since before he was born, and finding what? What did they find in those 40 feet? The diary does not say. The diary describes the dimensions, the air quality, the floor character. It does not describe the walls beyond what is implicit in the dimensions. It does not describe the ceiling beyond the height measurement. It does not describe whether there was anything on those walls or that floor or that ceiling, any mark, any pigment, any artifact. The absence of that description is its own kind of evidence. If the walls had been featureless natural sandstone, there would have been no reason to describe them as the dimensions of the space implied smooth walls. If the walls had carried features that a shift supervisor in 1980 was equipped to recognize and comfortable describing recent graffiti, a service pipe, a marker left by a previous construction crew, he would have described them. The absence of the description suggests that either the walls carried nothing worth noting, or they carried something that he did not know how to note, or he chose not to note what he found. The 11-day gap in the diary after the entry suggests that the third possibility is not implausible. There is a geologist, she works in the academic sector, and she has spent 30 years studying Hawkesbury sandstone in its various contexts. From the natural cave systems of the Greater Sydney Basin to the cut stone building material that frames the city's colonial heritage buildings, She is not a proponent of any particular theory about the underground anomalies. She is a scientist, and she speaks in the language of what the data can and cannot support. When asked about the 1862 passage description, specifically the characterization of the floor as level and smooth, as though by long use or deliberate working, she is precise. A natural joint-controlled void in Hawkesbury sandstone does not produce that floor character, she says. Natural erosion in the aerated zone above the water table proceeds through spalling, the gradual detachment of surface material along bedding planes. Spalling produces an irregular floor covered in accumulated debris. It does not produce a level surface. A level surface requires either deliberate material removal, working the floor down to a consistent height across the width and length of the space, or very long-term water action, which polishes rather than levels and leaves mineral deposits that are unmistakable on visual inspection. The 1862 description does not mention mineral deposits. It does not describe a polished surface. It describes a surface that is level and smooth in the way that a worked floor is level and smooth. The geologist's professional assessment. That description is not consistent with natural formation. If the floor is as described, the space was modified by human activity. When asked about the ceiling height 9 feet, consistent across the section explored, she is similarly precise. A natural joint-controlled void that has a consistent height over a length of 50 feet in Hawkesbury sandstone would be, in her experience, extremely unusual. The joint spacing in the formation varies on the scale of feet, not inches. A natural void extending along a joint plane would encounter cross joints at intervals that would alter the ceiling height. A consistent 9-foot height over 50 feet implies either an extraordinary coincidence of joint spacing, a single joint plane controlling the ceiling height across the entire explored section, or deliberate modification of the ceiling to achieve consistency. She assesses the former as possible but improbable, the latter as consistent with the overall physical description. Her conclusion, stated with the caution that a scientist applies to conclusions based on historical documentary evidence rather than direct physical observation, the 1862 passage, if accurately described, has a morphology that is inconsistent with natural formation and consistent with deliberate modification. Investigation would be warranted. She submitted a proposal to the relevant heritage body a number of years ago. The proposal was for a non-invasive assessment of the geological zones identified in the historical record, ground-penetrating radar and microgravity survey. No access to sealed spaces, no construction activity, no disturbance, an entirely surface-based remote sensing survey that would, in her assessment, provide sufficient data to determine whether the historical records are describing real subsurface features or whether the pattern can be explained by natural variation in the geological record. The proposal was declined on the grounds that the heritage significance of the proposed investigation sites had not been established. To establish the heritage significance, you need to investigate the sites. To investigate the sites, you need the heritage significance to have been established. She is familiar with the circularity. She has been living in it for long enough to describe it without visible frustration, in the manner of someone who has decided that frustration is an energy expenditure that the question does not warrant. The question will not be resolved through frustration. It will be resolved through persistence. She is still working on it. The proposal, revised and resubmitted in a different form to a different body, is pending. The oral tradition of the Gadigal people is not a single unified text. It is not a book that can be opened and cited. It is a living system of knowledge transmission, maintained through the relationships between knowledge holders and learners, transmitted in forms appropriate to those relationships, and governed by protocols that determine what is shared, with whom, in what context, and to what purpose. What ethnographers have been able to record what has entered the written record through the various encounters between colonial period researchers and Gadigal knowledge holders represents a partial and, in some cases, distorted sample of the knowledge system. Partial because much knowledge was not shared in those encounters, either because it was not appropriate to share or because the nature of the relationship between the ethnographer and the community did not permit it. Distorted because the conceptual frameworks through which colonial-era ethnographers organized and recorded what they heard were not adequate to the knowledge they were encountering. They translated into categories that were familiar to them, losing in the translation specifics that the original encoding had preserved. With those caveats clearly in place, the ethnographic record contains material that is relevant to the underground question. Multiple accounts, collected by different researchers in different periods from different community sources, describe underground spaces of cultural significance in the country around the harbour. The descriptions do not constitute a unified narrative. They are fragments, partial accounts, encoded in the language of informants speaking to outsiders in conditions that were not conducive to full disclosure. But the fragments share common elements. They describe underground spaces. They describe those spaces as significant, not incidentally significant, but significantly significant. The kind of significance that in Aboriginal Australian knowledge systems is attached to places that have major roles in the maintenance of law, the transmission of knowledge, and the relationship between the living community and the ancestral world. They describe, in some accounts, the presence of markings in the stone, not surface engravings of the kind visible in the national park above the waterline, but markings in enclosed spaces, in the dark, placed there for purposes that are not described in the available accounts, but that the tone of those accounts suggests were of the first order of significance. And they describe, in several accounts, the underground as a place that is, in some sense, still active, not abandoned, not historical, but present in the way that places of deep significance are present in Aboriginal Australian cosmologies. Active not in the physical sense of being currently occupied, but in the sense of carrying ongoing relational significance that is not diminished by the non-presence of people in the physical space. That understanding of place, the understanding that a significant location retains its significance across time, that the relationship between people and place is not severed by physical absence, is not compatible with the Western heritage management concept of a site as a static record of past activity. In the Western heritage framework, a site is significant because of what it tells us about what happened there in the past. In the Aboriginal Australian framework, a site is significant because of what it continues to be, not only what it was. An investigation of the underground sites beneath Sydney, to be appropriate and legitimate, would need to engage with that distinction. It would need to be designed not only as an archaeological investigation, what can we learn about the past from what the site contains, but as a cultural heritage process, what does the site continue to be, and how does the investigation relate to the community's ongoing relationship with it? Those are not the same process. Conflating them, or conducting the former in the absence of the latter, would repeat the colonial pattern in a new form. The community consultation process that would precede any investigation is not a box to tick. It is the substance of the first, most important phase of the work. The question of what investigation means in the context of a site like this is worth unpacking, because the word carries different implications in different contexts, and I want to be specific about what would actually be involved. In the popular imagination of archaeology, shaped by television, by film, by the genre of discovery narrative that makes great entertainment, archaeological investigation involves excavation. You dig. You find things. You display them. The drama is in the discovery moment, the brushing away of soil to reveal the object underneath, the examination of the object against the light. Archaeological investigation of underground rock-cut spaces does not typically work that way, and in this specific context, it definitely should not work that way. The sites are not buried under soil, they are within solid rock, accessed only through the passage openings. You do not excavate them, you enter them, and before you enter them, you study them. The first phase of investigation would be entirely non-invasive. It would use geophysical techniques, ground-penetrating radar, seismic refraction, electrical resistivity, tomography, microgravity measurement to build a picture of what is in the ground without disturbing it. These techniques are used routinely in geotechnical and archaeological contexts. They have different resolution limits and different sensitivities. Ground-penetrating radar can detect void spaces and structural anomalies in the rock to depths of several meters. Microgravity measurement can detect density anomalies, including the density difference between solid rock and an air-filled void to greater depths. Seismic methods can provide information about the structural character of the rock and identify zones where the rock has been modified. The output of the geophysical phase would be a subsurface map, a three-dimensional model of what is in the ground in the investigation zones, with the void features identified and their dimensions and orientations constrained as precisely as the technique limitations allow. That map would form the basis for planning any subsequent investigation. The second phase would be targeted optical investigation, the use of small camera systems, introduced through boreholes, to visually inspect the interior of void spaces before anyone enters them. This technique is used in cave exploration and in the inspection of sealed underground infrastructure. It allows an initial visual assessment of whether the void features contain anything significant: surface markings, artifactual deposits, features that require specific protocols for their proper investigation before the disturbance of entry is contemplated. Only after the geophysical mapping and the optical investigation would the question of physical access be addressed. And the question of physical access would be addressed in the context of the community consultation process, with community input on whether access is appropriate, what protocols should govern the investigation team's movement within the space, what can and should be documented and published, and what should remain within the community. This is not a quick process. A properly designed investigation along these lines, for 3 or 4 priority sites, would take between 3 and 5 years from the beginning of the community consultation phase to the publication of initial findings. It would cost more than a superficial survey and less than a kilometre of inner-city road construction. It would require coordination between heritage authorities, government infrastructure agencies, academic institutions, and the community. None of those requirements are beyond the capacity of the relevant institutions. The question of capacity is not the obstacle. The question of will is the obstacle. And will is the thing that changes when enough people understand what is at stake. There is a particular feeling that this question generates in the people who work on it, a feeling that the researcher with 2 declined applications describes when asked as something like vertigo. Not the vertigo of heights or the vertigo of physical instability, the vertigo of scale, the sudden, visceral awareness of how large the historical question actually is, how much time it spans, how many people it implicates, how far the implications extend from the specific geological features beneath specific streets in a specific city into the broad historical and political and moral questions about what this country is and who it belongs to and what honest reckoning with its history requires. The vertigo of looking at a 4-line entry in an 1793 drainage log and tracing, from those 4 lines, the thread that runs forward through 230 years of institutional choices and policy decisions and funding applications and construction diaries and geotechnical reports and oral tradition and community memory, thread that connects the sealed passage of 1793 to the sealed passage of 1980 to the passage that is sealed right now, tonight, beneath the city, you are probably within 100 kilometers of, as you listen to this. The thread is real. It connects those things. And following it is a form of vertigo, because it requires holding, simultaneously, the very small and the very large, the specific, technical, physically bounded question of what is in the rock at a depth of 40 feet at a specific geographic location, and the historical, political, moral, epochal question of what the answer to that specific question means for the way we understand this country and our obligations within it. That is a lot to hold. I have been asking you to hold it for the duration of this video, which has been a very long time by the standards of the thing you are probably using to watch it, and I am grateful for that holding. I think the question deserves it, but I also want to acknowledge that holding a question, even holding it carefully and seriously and with full awareness of its weight, is not the same as answering it. And answering it, the actual physical, material answering of the question of what is in the sandstone 40 feet beneath Sydney, requires something that this video cannot produce, and that no amount of careful archival reading or patient oral tradition maintenance can produce either. It requires access. It requires the opening of the passage. And that opening requires the institutional decision that has been deferred since 1793. Every year of deferral is a year in which the passage sits in the dark, with its still air and its level floor and its outstanding whatever is beyond the 40 feet that was explored in September 1980, waiting for the decision that has been due for 230 years. The passage does not know how long it has been waiting. The passage does not experience impatience. That is the stone's nature. But we do, and we should. Here is the version of this story that I could tell, and that I am choosing not to tell. I could tell you that beneath Sydney there is a vast, sophisticated pre-colonial city, a network of tunnels and chambers and inscriptions and artifacts of extraordinary richness, a civilizational record of comparable scale to the great archaeological sites of the Old World, suppressed by 2 centuries of colonial cover-up, motivated by conscious political calculation. That version is more dramatic. It would probably generate more views. It would satisfy the narrative hunger for revelation, for the uncovering of the hidden, for the dramatic vindication of what has been suppressed. But it is not what the evidence supports. What the evidence supports is more complicated and, I would argue, more interesting. It supports the existence of subsurface features, probably passages, possibly chambers that are inconsistent with natural formation, that are of uncertain origin and age, that carry probable cultural significance for the Gadigal people, an uncertain relationship to the specific knowledge systems of pre-colonial Sydney, and that have been subject to 2 centuries of institutional non-investigation that is best explained by the cumulative weight of a cultural preference for not asking rather than by any organized suppression. That version is not as clean. It does not resolve. It leaves you with questions that the dramatic version does not leave you with, because the dramatic version does all the resolution for you. It tells you what the suppressed thing is, who suppressed it, and why. The version that the evidence supports tells you only that something is there, that nobody has looked, that the looking is possible and overdue, and that the reason nobody has looked is institutional habit and cultural avoidance rather than conspiracy. The undramatic version requires more of you as a listener. It requires you to sit with uncertainty, with the genuine, unresolved uncertainty of a question that has the evidence to be asked but not yet the investigation to be answered. It requires you to resist the pull toward the dramatic conclusion and remain, instead, in the more uncomfortable position of knowing that the question is important and not knowing the answer. That is the position that everyone working on this question occupies: the researcher with the declined funding applications, the retired metro engineer, the community members maintaining the oral tradition. They are all in that position, knowing enough to know that the question is real and urgent, not knowing enough to know the answer, unable to get the institutional support they would need to find out. Sitting in that position is uncomfortable. It should be uncomfortable. The discomfort is the appropriate response to a situation that is genuinely uncomfortable, in which 230 years of institutional avoidance have produced a gap between what could be known and what is known, and in which the capacity to close that gap exists, but the will to close it does not yet. That discomfort is not something to resolve by choosing the more dramatic story. It is something to carry patiently, as the sandstone carries what it carries until the conditions change and the investigation becomes possible. There are things I want to say about the harbour, not about its geology, not about its history, not about the infrastructure beneath it, just about the harbour itself and the way it sits at the centre of the question we have been circling. Port Jackson, the harbour that Sydney was built on, the specific embayment of the Pacific Ocean that the First Fleet sailed into in January 1788, is a drowned river valley. That is its geological description. During the last ice age, when sea levels were substantially lower than they are today, the ancestral Parramatta River and its tributaries ran across what is now the harbour floor and out to an ocean that was further away. When the ice melted and sea levels rose, the river valleys were drowned and became the complex network of bays and coves and headlands that constitutes Port Jackson today. The Gadigal people and the other groups of the Eora Nation, whose territories surrounded the harbour, watched this process. They were there when the sea levels rose. They were there when the landscape that is now underwater was still above it. Their oral tradition contains accounts of landscape changes, of shorelines moving, of places that were once above water being submerged that are consistent with the geological record of sea level rise at the end of the last ice age. 65,000 years of presence on a landscape includes watching that landscape change in ways so slow that any individual's experience only captures a fragment of the movement, but so significant in the accumulated record that the oral tradition has maintained the memory of what was lost. The country beneath the harbour, the drowned river valleys and their slopes, the sandstone that extends below the waterline as well as above it, was once walkable, was once known, in the way that country is known when you live on it rather than over it, was once, in all probability, modified and marked and invested with significance in the way that the above-water country was. That part of the record is not recoverable in the same way as the underground passages might be. The harbour has had its own geological processes working on whatever was there. The drowned country is not in the preservation conditions that the dry underground sandstone is in. But the fact of it matters. The harbour is not just a body of water in which boats travel. It is a drowned landscape. It is the submergence of country that was lived in for thousands of years before the sea rose over it. The Gadigal people who stood on the shore and watched the colonial ships sail in had an ancestral memory of a different harbour, a different coastline, a different relationship between land and water in this specific location. That is a depth of historical relationship with a place that colonialism was not equipped to see and has been struggling to learn to see ever since. The underground passages, if they are what the evidence suggests, represent the part of that deep relationship that did not get drowned. They are the part of the pre-colonial landscape of Port Jackson that survived not because it was above water, but because it was below ground, protected by the same stone that made the country remarkable to begin with. It is, in the broadest possible sense, a story about what survives. I want to spend some time with the concept of partnership, because it is the concept that the investigation depends on and the one that is most easily gestured at without being genuinely engaged. The heritage researchers' 2 papers both end with calls for community-partnered investigation. The academic literature on Indigenous heritage management in Australia is full of such calls. The formal policy statements of heritage authorities at state and federal level contain language about consultation, about community involvement, about the primacy of Indigenous perspectives in the management of Indigenous cultural heritage. None of that language has translated into the investigation of the underground heritage of pre-colonial Sydney. The gap between the language and the practice is not, in this case, a gap that can be explained by cynicism alone. It is also a gap that reflects genuine structural difficulty. Partnership requires 2 parties who can engage with each other in ways that are productive and respectful, and that serve both parties' interests. For that engagement to be possible, there needs to be a relationship, a history of interaction that has built sufficient trust and mutual understanding to make the specific collaboration productive. The relationship between Australian heritage institutions and Indigenous communities has been, for most of the colonial period, adversarial in ways that have not been fully repaired. Heritage institutions protected colonial period heritage while actively dismantling Indigenous heritage. They removed objects from country to museums. They conducted research without community consent. They produced frameworks for heritage management that were built around colonial assumptions and applied them with varying degrees of modification to Indigenous heritage contexts where they did not fit. The repair of that relationship, the building of the trust that genuine partnership requires, is underway. It is underway in some places more than others, with some communities more than others, in some institutional contexts more than others. It is not finished. In many places, it has barely begun. In the context of the Sydney Underground investigation, the question of partnership is not a procedural requirement to be satisfied before the real work can begin. The partnership building is itself the first and most important phase of the work. Getting it right takes time, not the 2 weeks of a public consultation process, but the months and years of sustained engagement, relationship building, and the demonstration through action rather than words that the investigation is genuinely designed to serve community interests rather than to appropriate community knowledge for institutional purposes. That time investment is not optional. It is not a delay to the investigation. It is the precondition without which the investigation is not legitimate and should not proceed. The organizations and individuals who have the institutional authority to initiate this work need to understand that the community consultation phase is not a box to tick before the archaeology can start. It is the foundation on which everything else is built. Without it, the investigation is not possible in any meaningful sense. With it, the investigation is not just possible but powerful. The convergence of archival research, geological science, and Indigenous knowledge produces a synthesis that none of those things can achieve individually. That synthesis is what the question deserves. That synthesis is what 230 years of institutional avoidance has prevented. And that synthesis is what becomes possible when the institutions involved make the sustained commitment to building the relationship that genuine partnership requires. I've been talking for a long time about what is not known. Let me spend a moment on what is. What is known verifiably, documentably, with direct reference to primary sources is this. There are records in the State Archives of New South Wales, the Mitchell Library, the State Records of New South Wales, and various institutional archives that describe, spanning the period from 1793 to the present day, the presence of subsurface void features in the geological zones beneath the Sydney CBD and inner eastern suburbs. Those records were produced by multiple independent actors, colonial engineers, government surveyors, construction crews, project engineers, geotechnical consultants, with no coordinated relationship to each other and no evident motive for fabrication. The features described in those records are inconsistent with natural joint-controlled void formation in the Hawkesbury Sandstone, based on the geological literature on natural void morphology in that formation. The archival record for the relevant zones and periods contains gaps that are non-random, that cluster against the anomaly locations and against the periods of highest underground construction activity in those zones. The formal institutional response to the anomalous features across the full span of the record has been to seal and proceed without investigation. A formally published academic heritage assessment of these records has called for investigation and been declined funding on 2 occasions. The oral tradition of the Gadigal people, as partially recorded in the ethnographic literature, describes underground spaces of cultural significance in the harbour country. The geological conditions in the relevant zones are consistent with the preservation of surface modifications, pigment, and organic material introduced prior to European contact. That is what is known. What is not known, what cannot be known without investigation, is the precise location, dimensions, and character of the features, their age, the nature and extent of any modification they contain, what material, if any, is deposited in them, and what relationship they bear to the cultural and ceremonial knowledge systems of the Gadigal people. The gap between what is known and what is not known is not a gap of evidence. The evidence on the known side is substantial and consistent and well documented. The gap is a gap of investigation, a gap that has been maintained for 230 years by the institutional preference that this video has been describing. Closing that gap is the work. The work is possible. The work is overdue. The sandstone has been waiting. There is one final thing I want to say before the last passage of this video, and it is about you. Not about you in the sense of making a claim about who you are or what your relationship to this question is. I do not know who you are. I know that you are here, at this hour, in whatever the darkness or quiet of your current location is. I know that you have been listening for a very long time by any ordinary standard. What I want to say is something about why that matters. This question, the question of what is beneath Sydney, of who made it, of why it has not been investigated, of what investigation would require, and what it might produce, this question lives or dies in public attention. Not in the sense that public attention is more important than the archival research, or the geological science, or the community knowledge, or the institutional relationships that the investigation would require. All of those things are more directly important than public attention. But public attention is the context in which those things become possible. It is the context in which funding decisions get made, in which political will forms, in which institutional cultures shift under the weight of a public expectation that they behave differently. The heritage researchers' funding applications were declined in a context in which public attention to this question was minimal. The geotechnical designations of further investigation not required have persisted in a context in which no one, outside a small community of specialists and researchers, knows enough about the question to push back. That context can change. It changes when the question is understood by enough people to generate the kind of attention that makes indifference professionally costly. It changes when the person signing off on the geotechnical designation understands that their decision will be visible to an audience that knows enough about the question to evaluate it. I am not suggesting that viral attention is a substitute for proper process. It is not. The investigation must be properly designed, properly funded, properly partnered, properly conducted. No amount of public attention changes that requirement. What I am suggesting is that the proper process has been stalled for 230 years by the absence of the public attention that would make the stalling professionally costly for the institutions doing the stalling, and that the accumulation of people who understand the question, who have spent an evening listening to what the archive says and what the geology says and what the oral tradition says and what the institutional pattern reveals, is part of what creates the conditions under which the stalling becomes harder to maintain. You are part of that accumulation if you have made it this far. You now know something that most people do not know. You know the shape of the question. You know the 1,862 flaw. You know the 1,921 recommendation. You know the 1,980 diary entry with the 11-day gap. You know the geologist's assessment and the researcher's declined applications and the metro designation and the oral tradition and the geological conditions of preservation. You know enough to recognize, if you encounter this question again in a news article, in a heritage consultation, in a conversation about what this city is and what it owes, that it is a real question with a real archival basis and a real urgency. That recognition is not nothing. The sandstone of the Sydney Basin has a colour that changes with the light. In the morning it is pale gold, almost white in the direct sun of the early hours, warm and honey-coloured in the slant light of the longer morning shadows. In the afternoon it deepens, moves through amber and orange as the sun descends, until in the last light before sunset it burns, briefly, the same color as the December solstice sunrise that aligns with the passage orientation the records describe. In the evening it goes grey. Not the cold grey of concrete, but the warm grey of stone in shadow, still warm to the touch, holding the day's heat in the way that only dense material can. Underground, the sandstone has no colour variation. The same stone, below the light reach, exists in a permanent dim condition that is not quite grey and not quite anything else, a neutral, even, undifferentiated field against which any modification to the surface would be visible in the way that a mark is visible on a clean page. If the passages contain inscriptions, if the worked walls carry pigment or incised marks of the kind that the surface record of Aboriginal Australian rock art demonstrates was part of the Gadigal and Eora cultural practice, those marks would be preserved in the underground environment at a level of quality impossible to achieve on the surface, not faded, not weathered, not overwritten by subsequent use or damaged by UV exposure, present in the condition in which they were placed, in the dark, for however long the space has been sealed. The surface rock art of the Sydney Basin, the engravings in the national parks, the painted sites in the more protected coastal locations is magnificent. It is evidence of a sophisticated visual tradition, of careful attention to the relationship between image and stone, of specific knowledge encoded in specific forms. It is also inevitably subject to the damage of surface exposure, weathering, lichens, the mechanical damage of inadvertent foot traffic, the slow erosion of the material that makes the marks visible. Whatever is underground has none of that damage. Whatever is underground is in the condition of the day it was made. That is, depending on what it turns out to be, either very significant or very significant. Either it is inscribed in ways that tell us something extraordinary about the knowledge system that produced it, or it is bare stone, and the bare stone tells us the passage was used for purposes that did not require inscription, which is itself a significant finding about the nature of the space. Either way, the underground is not empty of meaning. Either way, the sandstone is holding something. Either what is there tells us what it was for, or what is not there tells us something about what it was for. The stone is always already speaking, in the two languages of mark and absence. The investigation is the act of learning to listen. I began this video at the harbour. I want to end it there, in a sense. Not at the postcard harbour, not the bridge and the opera house and the ferry wakes. At the harbour of the question. At the specific depth and specific darkness, where the geological record and the oral tradition and the archival evidence converge on a space that is real and sealed and waiting. The ferries still run across Port Jackson. The sandstone cliffs still frame the coves to the north and south. The light still hits the stone in the morning in the way it has always hit it, with the same angular relationship between sun and rock that has been constant for 10,000 years since the sea level stabilized at its current position. Below the ferry routes, below the cliffs, below the streets and the utilities and the metro tunnels and the geotechnical reports and the archive gaps, the passage is there. The air is still. The floor is level. Whatever the 1,980 crew found in those 40 feet is still there undisturbed, since they sealed the opening and maintained an 11-day silence. And the Gadigal elders, who hold the knowledge of what the underground means, they are there too, carrying the thread of 65,000 years across the gap that colonialism created, maintaining the knowledge in the forms available to them, waiting for the formal acknowledgement that the material record and the oral tradition together constitute something that the heritage management system of this country has an obligation to address. The obligation is clear. The path forward is clear. The investigation is possible. The partnership is buildable. The sites are preserved. The methods exist. The funding is available if the will is present. What is missing is only the decision. The sandstone does not make decisions. That is not what stone does. Stone holds. Stone preserves. Stone is patient in the way that nothing else is patient. The decision belongs to people, to the institutions that have the authority to say yes, to the researchers and community members who have been making the case. To the public, that creates the context in which institutions make decisions. To you at this hour, in whatever darkness or quiet this video has found you in, the passage is there. The question is there. The sandstone is holding it. And somewhere in the decision space between the institutional preference for not asking and the 65,000-year tradition of knowing this country in full, there is the investigation that has been waiting to happen since before you were born. There is a body of comparative archaeological literature, not about Sydney specifically, but about the investigation of subsurface rock-cut spaces in other parts of the world that is directly relevant to how an investigation of the Sydney sites should be designed, and that provides a useful point of reference for what is possible. The investigation of the underground city of Derinkuyu in Cappadocia, Turkey, is the most famous recent example of large-scale rock-cut underground space archaeology. Derinkuyu extends to a depth of approximately 60 meters and contained, at the time of its systematic investigation in the 1960s and subsequent decades, evidence of habitation on a substantial scale, carved rooms, ventilation shafts, wells, storage areas, and passages connecting multiple levels. The investigation established a construction timeline, identified the tools and methods used in the carving, and provided substantial data about how the space was used. What is relevant about the Derinkuyu investigation for the Sydney context is not the scale. The Sydney sites are not Derinkuyu in scale, and framing them as such would be misleading, but the method. The investigation of Derinkuyu proceeded systematically, from surface mapping through non-invasive survey through targeted investigation of specific features, with the findings of each phase informing the design of the next. The investigation produced results because it was designed to produce results. It was not a reactive process triggered by accidental discovery. It was a proactive program designed to investigate a specific question with specific methods calibrated to the specific geological and heritage context. That is the model that a Sydney investigation should follow. Not reactive, not designed to respond to what the next metro tunnel happens to break through, but proactive, designed in advance, calibrated to the specific geological context of the Hawkesbury Sandstone and the specific heritage context of the Gadigal country. Proceeding systematically from the archival work that has already been done through the geophysical survey that needs to happen next to the targeted optical investigation, and eventually to the carefully managed physical investigation of the most accessible and most significant sites. The Ethiopic rock-cut churches of Lalibela are a different but equally instructive comparison. The Lalibela churches are monolithic, carved from a single mass of rock, with passages and chambers and courtyards all cut from the same geological formation. Their investigation has proceeded over several decades, incorporating architectural survey, geological study, chronological research, and the engagement of the Ethiopian Orthodox community, whose traditions govern the spaces. The investigation has been shaped throughout by the understanding that the spaces are not archaeological specimens, but living heritage places that continue to be used for the purposes for which they were made. That understanding, the understanding that living heritage requires a different kind of investigation than dead heritage, is directly relevant to the Sydney Underground question. If the passages and chambers beneath Sydney are what the oral tradition describes them as being, they are living heritage in the Lalibela sense. They are not simply the record of a past practice. They are places with ongoing relational significance for the Gadigal community, whose investigation must be designed in a way that honors that ongoing significance, rather than treating the spaces as archaeological specimens to be extracted from their cultural context and delivered to the academic literature. That kind of investigation is possible. It is harder to design and harder to conduct than a straightforwardly academic archaeological investigation. It is more expensive and takes longer. but it is the only kind of investigation that would produce results that are legitimate in the full sense, legitimate not just scientifically, but in the cultural and political and relational sense that the heritage of pre-colonial Sydney demands. I want to return one more time to the question of why. Why has this investigation not happened? Not in the conspiratorial sense, not who is suppressing it, but in the structural sense, the institutional sense. The sense that illuminates the actual mechanisms through which a question that is clearly important and clearly possible to address has been systematically deferred for 230 years. The mechanisms are multiple and they reinforce each other. The first is the mechanism of professional incentive. In Australian heritage management, career advancement comes from the management of recognized heritage, from the protection and documentation and interpretation of sites that are already in the heritage register, that already have formal significance, that already have the legal protection that generates the bureaucratic work that careers are built on. The investigation of unrecognized heritage, heritage that doesn't yet have formal status, that requires the investigator to make the case for its significance rather than administering its already established significance, is professionally risky. It is risky because the case might not be made successfully, and the effort will have been wasted. It is risky because the case, if made successfully, will have political implications that the institution will have to manage. It is risky because the community partnerships it requires take time and personal relationship capital that is not easily replaced if the partnership fails. The path of least professional risk is to continue managing what is already managed and not to reach for what is not. The second mechanism is the mechanism of legal exposure. Heritage investigation in Australia operates within a complex legal framework that assigns specific rights and obligations to heritage authorities, landowners, development proponents, and heritage communities. An investigation of underground heritage in the Sydney CBD would intersect with this framework in ways that are genuinely complex. There are questions of access rights, of who has the authority to authorize investigation, of what the obligations are if significant heritage is found, of how the findings interact with native title and cultural heritage legislation. The legal complexity is a real deterrent for institutions that are risk-averse, and large government and quasi-government institutions are structurally risk-averse. The path of least legal risk is, again, to not investigate. The third mechanism is the mechanism of funding structure. Heritage investigation funding in Australia comes primarily from a small number of sources: federal and state heritage grants, university research funding, and development proponent contributions required under planning legislation. Each of these sources has specific criteria for what it will fund, and each of those criteria creates its own barrier for the Sydney underground investigation. Heritage grants tend to fund the protection and interpretation of already recognized heritage, not the investigation of potentially significant sites whose significance has not yet been formally established. University research funding is competitive and prefers projects with a strong probability of producing publishable results, which is complicated by the access issues that the Sydney investigation faces. Development proponent contributions are reactive. They fund the investigation of heritage encountered during development rather than the proactive investigation of unencountered heritage. The Sydney underground investigation falls between all of these funding mechanisms. It does not yet have the formal recognition that would make it eligible for heritage grant funding. It does not have the access conditions that would make it an attractive university research project. It is not triggered by a development proposal. It sits in the gap between existing funding structures, a gap that the question, through no fault of its own, has occupied for the entire duration of the funding regime. Changing any one of these mechanisms would not, by itself, produce the investigation. All three operate simultaneously, and addressing any one of them while the others remain in place does not open the path sufficiently. What is required is a coordinated shift across all three, a shift in the professional culture that makes investigating unrecognized heritage professionally rewarding rather than professionally risky. a shift in the legal framework that clarifies the rights and obligations associated with underground Indigenous heritage in a way that reduces rather than increases legal risk. And a new funding mechanism specifically designed for the proactive investigation of potentially significant heritage that falls between existing categories. That kind of coordinated institutional change is possible. It is the kind of change that has been produced in other areas of Australian heritage management when the public and political context has shifted sufficiently to make the status quo more costly than the change. It is the kind of change that requires sustained advocacy, sustained public attention, and sustained pressure from the research and community networks that understand the question. It has not happened yet. The conditions for it to happen are forming. The depth at which these features sit is worth dwelling on for a moment, because depth is not incidental to this question. 40 feet, 60 feet. The measurements that appear across the records: 32 feet for the 1,862 passage, 40 feet for the 1,871 chamber, approximately 35 to 40 feet for the museum station void, 60 feet for the St. James fitted stonework cluster, in a range that is, in the context of Hawkesbury sandstone geology, quite specific. That range is the depth of the aerated zone in the Sydney Basin sandstone. The aerated zone is the geological interval between the land surface and the permanent water table, in which the rock is neither saturated nor connected to surface conditions. Water moves through the aerated zone episodically during rainfall, percolating downward, but the zone is not permanently saturated. In the dry periods between rainfall events, the zone is occupied by air rather than water. In the Hawkesbury sandstone of inner Sydney, the aerated zone sits, on average, in the range of 30 to 70 feet below the surface, depending on the local topography and the distance from the harbour. The features described in the records sit, consistently, at depths within that range. This could be coincidence. Natural joint-controlled voids occur throughout the formation and are not restricted to the aerated zone. If the features were natural, there would be no particular reason for them to cluster in the aerated zone rather than being distributed across the full depth range of the formation. But if the features were deliberate, if someone chose where to create them, then the aerated zone is precisely where you would want to locate a space intended for long-term use and long-term preservation. The aerated zone is the stable zone, the dry zone, the zone of consistent temperature and humidity where materials introduced into the rock are preserved rather than saturated or degraded. A space cut into the aerated zone of Hawkesbury sandstone would, if sealed, maintain those conditions essentially indefinitely. Someone who knew the sandstone as well as 65,000 years of continuous relationship with it would allow a person to know it. Someone who had watched materials decay in the humid lower zones and persist in the dry upper ones, who had developed through accumulated generational experience an empirical understanding of how the stone behaves at different depths. That person might well have located significant underground spaces in the aerated zone. Deliberately. The clustering of the documented anomalies in the aerated zone is not proof of deliberate location, but it is consistent with it, and consistent with deliberate location in the context of a pattern of multiple other indicators of deliberate modification is an observation that belongs in the analysis. The geological and the cultural are not separate in this question. The knowledge system of the Gadigal people was deeply embedded in the specific physical characteristics of their country: the sandstone, the harbour, the seasonal patterns, the relationship between the landscape and the sky. A knowledge of how sandstone behaves at depth, of which zones preserve and which degrade, of where to locate something for the purpose of its long-term maintenance. That knowledge is exactly the kind of empirical, practically encoded knowledge that survives in oral tradition and that is legible, now, as consistent with the archaeological and geological evidence. That legibility, the convergence between the knowledge, tradition, and the scientific record, is not a coincidence, and it is not projection. It is what happens when you stop treating indigenous knowledge and Western science as separate systems and start reading them as complementary sources of information about the same reality. Sometimes, late in a long video like this, the mind starts to drift. And I want to use that drift, rather than fight it, because the questions that come when the analytical mind loosens its grip are sometimes the most important ones. What would it mean to know? Not to suspect, not to have the pattern, not to be able to trace the shape of the archival avoidance. To know, to have stood in the passage, to have measured the floor and documented the walls and run the dating samples, and sat with the knowledge holders as they interpreted what the material evidence meant in the context of the oral tradition. To have the full account? What would change? The simple answer, the answer that the question seems to invite, is that the history would change. The official history of Sydney, of Australia, of the relationship between the colonial period and what preceded it, would have to incorporate something new. A level of architectural sophistication, a depth of knowledge, a relationship between people and stone that the colonial period's official self-understanding had no room for. The historical narrative would be larger, more complex, more honest. That would change things. Not immediately, not automatically, not without the political and legal and cultural work of translating a historical finding into concrete consequences. But over time, through the processes by which historical findings enter public consciousness and shift the shared understanding of who we are and where we are and what we owe each other, it would change things. But there is another answer to the question of what would change, and it is less about the official historical record and more about the lived experience of the people whose history this is. For the Gadigal community, for the people who have been maintaining the knowledge of the underground significance across 230 years of colonial suppression of that knowledge, formal investigation, formal acknowledgement of what they already know to be true would mean something different than an interesting historical finding. It would mean the return of something that was taken, not in the physical sense, the knowledge was not destroyed, it was maintained, but in the sense of formal legibility. The conversion of knowledge that exists in community into knowledge that exists in the formal record, in a form that is receivable by the legal and administrative systems that govern how the country is managed. That conversion matters. It matters. Legally formal heritage recognition translates into formal protection and formal consideration in planning decisions. It matters politically. Acknowledged cultural connection to country strengthens the position of communities in land rights and native title processes. It matters in less definable ways too, in the sense that the formal acknowledgement of what a community knows to be true about their history and their relationship with their country is itself a form of recognition that is not nothing, even when it does not immediately produce practical outcomes. The investigation is not just about producing a finding for the academic literature. It is about producing a formal record that the Gadigal community has been owed for 230 years. There is a quality to certain kinds of questions that makes them persist, that makes them return, generation after generation, in different forms, refusing to be permanently closed by the institutional decision to not ask. The Sydney Underground question has that quality. It has been raised in one form or another since at least the 1862 passage description, which was the first moment in the colonial record when what was found underground was specific enough to generate a note that could not be entirely explained away. It has been raised in the 1921 Public Works Report, which acknowledged its existence at the level of internal administrative documentation before recommending that it not be raised further. It has been raised in the Eastern Suburbs Railway Diary, which recorded the outstanding quality of what was found without explaining it. It has been raised in the academic papers that have called for investigation. Each raising has been followed by a closing. The note filed under drainage. The internal report shelved. The diary silence. The funding applications declined. But the question itself has not stayed closed. Each new generation of underground construction activity creates new opportunities for the question to re-emerge. Each new generation of researchers inherits the archival trail. Each new generation of Gadigal knowledge holders maintains the oral tradition. The question persists because it is real. That is the most fundamental thing about it. Questions that are not real questions, that are built on misidentification or wishful thinking, or the projection of narrative onto ambiguous data, do not persist in this way. They dissolve when the ambiguous data is better understood, when the misidentification is corrected, when the narrative runs out of new situations to project onto. The Sydney Underground question does not dissolve. It grows more specific and more internally consistent with each new archival find, each new geological analysis, each new community account. It is growing more specific and more internally consistent right now, as the metro construction generates new geotechnical data and as researchers continue to work the archives. The question is accumulating evidence at a rate that makes the institutional decision to not ask increasingly difficult to sustain on purely intellectual grounds. The sustainability of the not asking position rests, at this point, not on the weakness of the evidence, but on the strength of the institutional culture that has maintained the position for 230 years. That is a precarious kind of sustainability. Institutional cultures can sustain positions that the evidence does not support for a very long time, but not forever. They can sustain them until the cost of maintaining the position exceeds the cost of changing it. That threshold is approaching. The metro construction has placed the anomaly zones in proximity to active infrastructure work in a way that will eventually produce a confrontation between the evidence and the institutional preference. A tunnel boring machine does not share the geotechnical engineer's preference for not asking. If it encounters a void of the dimensions described in the Eastern Suburbs Railway Diary, it will register that encounter in data that cannot be filed away in the same way that a handwritten note can be filed away. The question will not stay closed forever. The only choice available is between opening it deliberately in a designed investigation, with proper community partnership, with proper methods, in a way that produces the most useful and most legitimate findings, or opening it accidentally, in the reactive context of a construction encounter, with whatever time and access the construction context permits, in a way that is less likely to produce either the community partnership or the methodological quality that the question deserves. The deliberate opening is better in every way. It is better for the heritage, it is better for the community, it is better for the scientific outcome. It is better for the institutional relationship with the community that the heritage management system is trying to build. And it is better for the city, which has a long-term interest in understanding its own history as fully and as honestly as possible. The deliberate opening requires only the decision to make it. I have been talking about Sydney, but I want to be clear that Sydney is not the only place in Australia where questions like this exist, and that the pattern of institutional avoidance that Sydney exemplifies is not unique to Sydney. The history of underground modification in Aboriginal Australian contexts is a relatively underdeveloped area of the archaeological literature, in part because the literature has historically been shaped by assumptions about what kinds of spaces Aboriginal Australians were likely to have used and modified. The assumption that subterranean modification was not a significant part of Aboriginal Australian cultural practice is not well supported by the evidence. It reflects the limits of what early researchers knew and the assumptions that carried rather than a thorough examination of the question. There are documented cases of underground modification by Aboriginal Australians in other geological contexts. The use of limestone caves, the Nullarbor Plain caves, the caves of the Kimberley, the cave systems of the Grampians for ceremonial purposes, including the deposition of significant objects and the creation of markings in the underground darkness, is documented in the archaeological literature. The maintenance of cave environments for ceremonial use, including modifications to control access and to shape the acoustic and visual environment of the space, is consistent with what is known about Aboriginal Australian ceremonial practice across the continent. What the Sydney case adds to this picture is the specific context of sandstone, a geological material that can be actively worked rather than simply used in its natural form, and the specific context of a major urban environment where the underground is actively managed for infrastructure purposes rather than being remote and largely unmanaged. The combination of workable stone, deep cultural connection, and intensive subsequent urban development creates exactly the conditions in which underground heritage would be simultaneously most significant, most preserved, and most at risk. But the broader question, whether underground modification was a feature of Aboriginal Australian cultural practice in other sandstone environments across the continent, is a question that has received inadequate research. Attention. The Blue Mountains, the Hunter Valley, the Flinders Ranges, the sandstone escarpments of Arnhem Land, these are all environments with workable sandstone and documented deep Aboriginal connection. The question of whether the underground heritage of those environments has been investigated with anything approaching the attention that the surface heritage has received is, in most cases, a question to which the answer is inadequately. Sydney is the most urgent case because it is the most at risk, the most intensive urban development pressure, the most active underground construction program, the most compressed timeline before inadvertent destruction becomes likely. But Sydney is not the only case. The pattern of institutional avoidance and the need for community-partnered investigation extends across the continent. In the same way that the oral traditions that describe underground significance extend across the continent, what Sydney demonstrates, if it is investigated properly and the findings are made public, is both what is possible and what has been missed. That demonstration would have implications not just for Sydney's heritage management, but for the heritage management of Australian sandstone country more broadly. The threshold is Sydney. Once it is crossed there, the case for crossing it elsewhere becomes demonstrably achievable. Let me describe the specific act of reading an archival gap. You are in a research library, the Mitchell Library, say, which is the great repository of New South Wales historical records and sits just west of the art gallery in the Domain, in a building that is itself built from Hawkesbury sandstone. You have requested a series of Public Works Department records. The finding aid, the index that tells you what the collection contains, lists a continuous run of project files for a given set of construction activities in a given set of years. You go through the files. Each file covers a discrete project. The files have a consistent structure, a summary document, a series of survey notes, a set of engineering drawings, the contractor correspondence. You read through them. You are looking for the geological observation records from the tunneling work. And then you get to the file that covers a specific project in a specific year in a specific location, and the structure is not consistent. The summary document is there, the engineering drawings are there, but the survey notes are absent. There is a folder insert that says the survey notes are on file, but the notes themselves are not in the folder. And the contractor correspondence for the critical period, the period when the tunneling was active in the anomaly zone, is present for the weeks before and the weeks after that period, but not for the critical period itself. The folder is not damaged. The absence is not the result of physical deterioration. The files on either side of it are intact. The absence is specific to the critical period and to the specific category of document, the geological observation records that would contain the information most relevant to the question. You note the absence. You request a search of the broader collection for the missing materials. They may have been misfiled, catalogued under a different heading, attached to a different project file. The search comes back with nothing. The materials are not locatable. They may have been lost, they may have been removed, they may have been destroyed through inadvertence rather than intention, or they may have been filed in a location that is not easily accessible, a location that requires knowing what you are looking for to find it, in the way that the 1921 report is in a location that requires knowing it exists. You cannot know which explanation applies. That is the nature of archival gaps. They are ambiguous. They do not come with explanations. They simply are. But you can look at their pattern. You can ask, is this gap random or does it cluster? You can compare the location and timing of the gap with the location and timing of other gaps in the same record series. And when you do that comparison for the Sydney Underground records, you find the clustering that I've been describing throughout this video, the non-random pattern of absence that corresponds with the anomaly zones and the periods of highest underground construction activity. Non-random clustering of archival gaps is not, by itself, evidence of intentional suppression. It can result from a variety of other causes: a particular filing clerk who had a specific habit that produced non-random misfiling, a water event that damaged a specific cabinet, a records management decision that separated certain categories of document from others. All of those explanations are possible. What the pattern requires, what it demands, if you are committed to epistemic honesty, is an explanation. Not the assumption that a benign explanation exists, but the actual identification of a benign explanation that accounts for the specific pattern. And that explanation has not been produced. The pattern has been noted by researchers, the request for investigation has been made, and the response has been silence. Silence in response to a specific, documented pattern of archival anomaly is not an explanation. It is the continuation of the pattern. There is one more thing I want to tell you about the sandstone, and then we will be close to the end. Hawkesbury sandstone is an acoustic material. Not in the way that concert halls or cathedrals are acoustic, not shaped and engineered to produce specific sonic effects, but in the way that stone is naturally acoustic. It transmits sound rather than absorbing it. It reflects rather than diffuses. It creates in enclosed spaces a reverberant quality that is different from the acoustic of a space lined with organic material. Underground spaces in sandstone have a distinctive acoustic. They hold sound in a way that surface spaces do not. A voice in a sandstone chamber carries differently than a voice in the open air. It fills the space more completely. It has a presence, a spatial extension that the human voice in open air does not have. And in a sealed, dry, still space of the dimensions described in the records, 8 to 12 feet high, 7 feet wide, extending for 40 and more feet, that acoustic quality would be marked. The acoustic properties of underground spaces are not incidental in the archaeology of ritual and ceremony. They have been studied extensively in the context of European Paleolithic cave art, where researchers have found consistent correlations between the placement of painted images and the points of highest acoustic responsiveness in the cave system. The acoustic of the space appears to have been a factor in the selection of locations for significant marks. The experience of sound in the underground, the way voice and percussion interact with enclosed stone, appears to have been part of the ceremonial significance of the space. In the Aboriginal Australian ceremonial context, sound is a medium of significance. Not incidentally, not as background to a primarily visual experience, but as a primary medium through which knowledge is transmitted, relationships are maintained, and the connection between the living community and the ancestral world is enacted. Song, percussion, voice. These are not accompaniments to ceremony. In many traditions, they are the ceremony. A space with a distinctive acoustic, a space in which voice and song carry differently, in which the experience of sound is altered by the enclosure, and the stone would not be acoustically significant by accident. In a knowledge system in which sound is a primary medium of ceremonial practice, the acoustic properties of a space are a functional characteristic. They matter. They inform the selection of the space, the specific uses to which it is put, the experience of those within it. Whether the passages described in the Sydney records have an acoustic that would have been significant in Gadigal ceremonial practice, whether their dimensions, their orientation, their surface character create the reverberant quality that would make them acoustically distinctive, is a question that can only be answered by being in them, by standing in them and making sound and hearing what the stone does with it. Nobody has done that. The crew that stood in the St. James Passage in September 1980 may have made sound, may have spoken, may have called back to each other, and may have heard what the stone did with their voices. But they did not record it. They did not know enough about the significance of the acoustic to know that it was worth recording. The space is there. The acoustic of the space, whatever it is there. The stone has not changed. When the passage is opened, if it is opened, the first person to stand in it and make sound will hear something that has not been heard, in all probability, for a very long time. They will hear the stone's response to human voice. And that response will be part of the answer to the question of what the space was and what it was for. I want to speak in this last passage, before the closing, about the people who are not in this story. The people who are not in this story are the ones who would have built the passages, not archaeologically, not in the sense of reconstruction, but personally. The individuals who stood in the aerated zone of the Hawkesbury Sandstone Formation at a depth of 30 or 40 feet, with tools in their hands and a specific purpose before them, and worked the stone, who measured the ceiling height and took it to 9 feet, who leveled the floor and maintained it clear, who oriented the passage to the north-northeast and understood, in the knowledge system they were working within, why that orientation was the right one. We do not know their names. We will not know their names. The knowledge system that produced them transmitted names and lineages and histories through the oral tradition, not through inscriptions in stone that survived to be read, and even if there were inscriptions in the passages, the language in which they were written would need to be understood rather than simply deciphered. The people who worked this stone are not recoverable as individuals, in the way that Roman engineers or medieval builders are recoverable as individuals through the written record. What is recoverable, what the investigation would recover, is the record of their work, the specific tool traces in the specific stone, the specific dimensions of the specific spaces, the specific orientation of the specific passages, the material, if any, that they placed in those spaces for the purposes that the spaces were designed to serve. Not their names, not their faces, not the personal experience of standing in the stone and working it, but the outcome of their work, preserved in exactly the condition in which they left it. That is not nothing. That is, in fact, an extraordinary thing. In archaeology, the direct record of skilled human work, the physical trace, left by the specific decisions and movements of specific people engaged in a specific practice, is the most intimate contact the discipline has with the past. It is closer than the literary record, which is mediated by language and translation and interpretation. It is closer than the historical record, which is mediated by the choices of those who kept and those who discarded. It is the actual encounter, across whatever span of time, separates the worker from the investigator, with the specific physical trace of a specific human act. The investigation of the Sydney Underground would produce that encounter. It would produce, for the first time, direct physical contact with the work of people who inhabited this country before European contact, in a context that the colonial history of Australia has made extraordinarily rare. It would produce the kind of knowledge that the heritage management system is supposed to exist to recover and protect. It would also produce something else, something that is harder to categorize but perhaps more important. It would produce a formal acknowledgement in the language that the administrative and legal systems of this country recognize that the people who worked that stone were not simply present in this country, but were engaged in practices of extraordinary sophistication and significance, practices that left permanent marks in the permanent stone of their country, marks that have outlasted 230 years of colonial settlement built directly above them. That acknowledgement matters. It has always mattered. The failure to produce it for 230 years is among the most significant failures of the heritage management system that was built over those same years. And the production of it, the formal, material, scientifically grounded acknowledgement of what was done in the stone of the Sydney Basin before the first fleet arrived, is among the most important things that the heritage management system could do right now. In this moment, with the tools and the knowledge and the community partnerships that are available to it. The passage is there. The work of those unknown people is there. The stone has been holding it. And the question of whether the formal acknowledgement they are owed will finally be produced is the live question that this video has been building towards since the first minute. That question does not have an answer in this video. It has only the shape of the investigation that would produce one. And in that shape, in the specific, careful, community-partnered, methodologically rigorous investigation that is possible and overdue, is the possibility of something that the City of Sydney has not yet managed to do in 230 years of trying to understand what it has been built on. The possibility of genuinely knowing. The sandstone is 40 feet down. The passage is there. The question is open. Wherever you are right now, whatever time it is, I hope you carry some part of that with you as you close your eyes. Not as anxiety, not as the nagging of an unresolved thing, but as the particular quality of rest that comes from having spent time with a question that matters, from having sat with something real and patient and important and allowed it to be exactly as large as it actually is. The sandstone will still be there in the morning, and the day after. And the day after that, patient, holding, waiting for the decision that has been due for a very long time. Sleep well. I have been trying, throughout this video, to be honest about the limits of what is known. Let me do that one final time, explicitly, in the way that a proper accounting of a question should always end. The evidence that something exists beneath Sydney, that the void features described in the archival record are real, pre-existing, and inconsistent with natural formation is strong. It is not conclusive. Conclusive evidence requires physical investigation of the kind that has not been done. But the pattern of independent corroboration across 2 centuries, the geological assessment of the described features, the oral tradition of the Gadigal community, and the archival gap pattern collectively constitute a body of evidence that, in any normal research context, would be considered more than sufficient to justify formal investigation. The refusal to investigate is not a reflection of the weakness of the evidence. It is a reflection of the institutional culture that has managed the question. The evidence that the features are pre-colonial, that they were created by people living in this country before European contact, is suggestive rather than conclusive. The geological conditions are consistent with preservation over pre-colonial timescales. The physical descriptions are inconsistent with colonial period engineering practice. The oral tradition specifically describes underground significance in a way that is consistent with the physical record. But without the dating program that the research tools could now perform, the pre-colonial origin of the features remains a well-supported hypothesis rather than a demonstrated finding. The evidence that the features are the work of the Gadigal people specifically, rather than of earlier populations who may have inhabited the Sydney Basin before the Gadigal, is the most uncertain element of the question. The Gadigal oral tradition claims the underground as part of their country's heritage, and there is no reason to doubt that claim. But the time depth of Aboriginal Australian presence in the Sydney Basin, combined with the uncertainty about the age of the features, means that the specific cultural attribution of the work cannot be assumed. It is a question that the investigation would address, rather than one that can be settled in advance of investigation. These qualifications are not reasons to defer the investigation. They are reasons to conduct it with the kind of intellectual and methodological rigor that important, uncertain questions deserve. They are reasons to approach the investigation as a genuine inquiry, open to what the evidence shows, rather than committed in advance to a particular finding. They are reasons to design the investigation in a way that can address all of the relevant questions rather than only the ones that are most easily answered. What the qualifications are not, and what they have been used as, is a reason to not investigate at all. The uncertainty about the precise age and cultural attribution of the features is not the uncertainty of a question that lacks evidence. It is the uncertainty of a question that lacks investigation. Those are not the same thing. The investigation resolves the uncertainty. The refusal to investigate maintains it permanently, by choice, at the cost of the heritage resource that the investigation would characterize and protect. 230 years of maintained uncertainty. The resolution has always been available. The question has always been answerable, at least in principle. The path from where we are, from the archival record and the geological assessment and the oral tradition, to the full material answer, runs through the investigation that has been deferred since 1793. Every night that Sydney sleeps above its sandstone, the passage is down there in the dark. Level floor, 9 feet of ceiling, dry and still. Oriented northeast, the investigation is the act of turning the light on. The light has been off for a very long time. Someone has to decide to turn it on. That decision, that specific, institutional, formally consequential decision to initiate the proper, community-partnered, methodologically rigorous investigation of the underground heritage of pre-colonial Sydney is the thing that everything in this video has been pointing toward. It is not a dramatic decision, in the way that the story it is part of is dramatic. It is an administrative decision made by specific people in specific institutional roles, within specific frameworks and constraints. It is the decision to commission the community consultation process, to fund the archival review, to authorize the geophysical survey, to allow the dating program, to produce the heritage assessment that the Heritage Register requires and the community deserves. It is the decision to ask. 230 years of not asking. One decision to start. The sandstone will still be there when the decision is made. 40 feet down, patient, holding whatever it holds. Unchanged in the way that stone is unchanged by the passage of time in the darkness, the time of archival records being sealed, of funding applications being declined, of diary entries being left without sequel, of geotechnical reports being filed under no further action. All of that time, the stone has been the same. The passage has been the same. The air has been still and dry, and the floor has been level, and the ceiling has been 9 feet high, and the orientation has been north-northeast. And somewhere beyond the 40 feet that were explored in September 1980, beyond the point at which the crew turned back because continuing would have taken them outside the scope of their assigned work, there is more. Whatever outstanding meant to the shift supervisor who underlined it and then kept an 11-day silence. Whatever the 1921 report was recommending against investigating. Whatever the archive gaps were clustering around. Whatever the oral tradition has maintained across 65,000 years of relationship with this specific stone in this specific country. It is there. We have not looked. We still can. The question of what a city owes its underground is not one that most cities have had to ask seriously. Most cities are built on ground that was previously inhabited by people whose cultural relationship to the underground was not a primary feature of their heritage record. Most cities have subsurface records that are, for the most part, the record of their own development, the accumulated archaeology of their own building and rebuilding across the centuries of their existence. Rome's underground is Roman underground. Istanbul's underground is Byzantine and Ottoman. The layers go back, but they go back into the same civilizational stream that produced the surface. Sydney is different. Sydney's underground, if the archival record and the geological assessment and the oral tradition are pointing at what they appear to be pointing at, is not the archaeological record of Sydney's own development. It is the record of the 65,000-year civilization that existed here before Sydney's development began. It belongs to a different civilizational stream, not the colonial stream that built the city, but the stream that the city was built over. That distinction matters for the question of what the city owes its underground. The city does not owe its underground in the same way that it owes its drainage infrastructure, or its railway system, or the foundations of its colonial buildings. Those are things the city made, maintains, and is responsible for in the administrative sense. The underground of pre-colonial heritage is not something the city made. It is something that was made by the people whose country the city was built on, and that the city has, in the process of its building, enclosed and sealed and left in the dark. The obligation that creates is not an administrative obligation, it is a moral and historical obligation. It is the obligation that comes from inhabiting a place whose prior history you have not acknowledged, from building a city over a country whose prior use you have not examined, from maintaining, for 230 years, a preference for the comfortable ignorance of not asking over the uncomfortable knowledge of what the asking would reveal. That obligation has a very specific, very practical, very achievable expression. Commission the investigation, fund the archival review, authorize the geophysical survey. Engage the community in the partnership that genuine investigation requires. Open the process that has been closed since 1793. Begin, finally, to look. The sandstone will still be there when the investigation begins. The passage will still be there. The air will still be dry and still. The floor will still be level, and the ceiling will still be 9 feet high, and the orientation will still be north-northeast, and whatever is beyond the 40 feet that were explored in September of 1980 will still be exact as it was when the crew sealed the opening and walked back to the surface, and started an 11-day silence that has, in the metaphorical sense at least, never quite ended. The silence is the thing that the investigation breaks, not with drama, not with revelation at volume, but with the patient, careful, methodologically rigorous, community-partnered attention that the question has been waiting for since it was first sealed over in 1793. The sandstone is patient. We do not have to be. Here, at the very end, is the simplest version of what this video has been trying to say. Something is beneath Sydney. The evidence for it is real and spans 230 years. The geological conditions ensure that it is preserved. The oral tradition of the Gadigal people describes its significance. The investigation that would characterize it properly is possible, affordable, and overdue by approximately 2 centuries. The decision to investigate has not been made. The decision to not investigate has been made, again and again, by institutions whose reasons for making it have changed, but whose conclusion has remained the same. The passage is down there, the floor is level, the air is still. It is time to turn the light on. Good night.